The bell was meant to make her ridiculous. By 11:30 on a pale May morning in 1848, the subscription room of the Ladies' Benevolent Refuge had filled with silk, perfume, polished charity, and the kind of laughter that never raised its voice, because it did not need to. Miss Margaret Ellery stood beside the collection table, in a plain dove-grey gown that had been brushed and pressed until thrift looked almost like discipline. At her throat, fastened carefully to a modest fichu, rested a small black jet brooch containing a curl of her mother's hair. It was the only ornament she wore. It was also, Lady Portia Draycott had murmured not 10 minutes earlier, the most faithful companion Miss Ellery is ever likely to keep. The ladies nearest the punch table had smiled into their teacups. Margaret had heard them. Of course, she had heard them. At 40, a woman learned that society never whispered softly enough to be innocent. She had also learned the art of not lowering her head. The room belonged to the refuge this morning, at least in name. Its stated purpose was noble. Widows, discharged governesses, seamstresses with failing eyes, and gentlewomen fallen into poverty were to be assisted with temporary lodging, work recommendations, and small grants of money. Its actual purpose, as far as the ladies of London seemed concerned, was to allow women with warm houses and full jewel cases to admire themselves for pitying women without either. At the center of the long table sat a lacquered collection box, and beside it a small silver arms bell, old enough to have lost its shine at the rim. Its stem was slightly bent. The clapper had a faint crack, so the sound it made was not clear and sweet, but thin, uneven, almost embarrassed. Margaret had noticed that first. She noticed damaged things because she had spent much of her life being told, politely and otherwise, that she was one of them. Miss Ellery, Lady Portia said brightly, gliding toward the table in pale rose silk with 3 unmarried girls following her like obedient petals. We have decided you must help us mark each contribution. It will lend the morning such spirit. Margaret looked at the bell, then at Lady Portia's perfect smile. I have already offered to reconcile the subscription list, Lady Portia. Oh, but numbers are so dreary. Portia lifted the bell and placed it in Margaret's hand. This will be much more festive. Whenever a donation is made, you shall ring it. Mrs. Felicity Royston, a widow whose mourning had long ago become more fashionable than sincere, gave a soft laugh. How charming. A bell for charity. Portia tilted her head. Her eyes shone with malice, made elegant by breeding. And how suitable. We must give Miss Ellery a chance to hear wedding bells somehow. The room did not burst into laughter. That would have been vulgar. It rippled. A fan lifted here. A shoulder trembled there. A young lady hid her mouth behind lemon-colored gloves. The cruelty moved through the room like a draught under a door, cold enough to touch every ankle and invisible enough for everyone to deny. Margaret felt the bell's narrow handle press against her palm. For one instant, she saw herself as they intended her to appear. A woman past the season of being chosen, standing beside a box, for the unfortunate, ringing a bell that mocked the one sound society believed she had failed to earn. Bride, wife, duchess, anything but Miss Ellery, useful when a list needed mending, invisible when a room began to sparkle. She breathed once quietly. Her mother's brooch rested against her pulse. No woman is finished because others stop expecting her happiness. Very well, Margaret said. Her voice did not shake. If the refuge requires a bell, I shall ring it accurately. Portia's smile sharpened, disappointed perhaps that Margaret had not flinched visibly. How dutiful! The first donor was Lady Ashburn, who dropped a sovereign through the slit in the box with an expression of pained magnificence. Margaret rang the bell once. Its cracked sound trembled across the room. Several ladies smiled again. The next donation came from Mrs. Royston herself, who made a performance of searching her reticule before offering several coins. "There, Miss Ellery, you may ring with gratitude." Margaret rang once. Then she bent over the subscription sheet and wrote the amount clearly beside Mrs. Royston's name. Beneath the sheet, half hidden by a folded circular, lay her own small black notebook. She opened it only an inch and wrote another name in tiny script. Mrs. Ada Pike, seamstress, left eye failing, requested lamp oil and winter lodging. Not an amount, a name. That was what the committee forgot most readily. Money could be counted by any clerk. A name had to be carried by someone with a conscience. A third lady donated, then a fourth. The bell sounded each time, thin and uneven, until the joke became almost ceremonial. Margaret stood through it with her back straight, her gloved hand steady, and her face composed into an expression so calm that those who did not know better might have mistaken it for indifference. It was not indifference, it was discipline. The door opened while she was recording the fifth donation. Conversation altered before it ceased. It did not stop all at once. It tightened, as if an invisible cord had been drawn through every throat in the room. Margaret did not look up immediately. She finished the figure beside Lady Ashburn's second contribution, dried the ink with sand, and only then allowed her gaze to follow everyone else's. Everard Kelling-ford, Duke of Kelling-ford, stood just inside the doorway. No announcement should have been necessary for a man like him. Rank arrived before he did. He was tall, dark-haired, and severe in a coat cut with such exactness that it made every brighter gentleman in the room look over-decorated. At 44, he possessed the polished authority of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. He was also, as every woman in London seemed determined to remember, unmarried. Unlike Margaret's unmarried state, his was treated as proof of discernment. He had refused heiresses, beauties, widows, and rumours with the same cool courtesy. Mothers praised him as difficult. Daughters called him tragic. Men called him powerful. Margaret had never called him anything at all, because men such as the Duke of Kelling-ford did not ordinarily belong to the portion of the room where she stood. Lady Portia moved first. "Your Grace, what an honour. We had not expected you so early." "Evidently," the Duke said. His voice was low, controlled, and clear enough to make 3 conversations die unfinished. His gaze moved from Portia to the bell in Margaret's hand, then to the donation box, then to Margaret's face. Not quickly, not carelessly. He looked as though he had seen not merely the object, but the arrangement of the cruelty around it. "We are making the morning lively," Portia said, with a laugh as light as blown sugar. "Miss Ellery has been so good as to ring for each contribution." "Has she?" His gaze returned to Margaret. "Miss Ellery." No one in the room had expected him to know her name. Margaret felt the smallest shift in the air around her, a collective recalculation. She curtsied. "Your Grace, is the table secure?" he asked. The question was so practical, so unsentimental, that for a moment no one understood it. Margaret did. The bell had begun to wobble near the edge because Mrs. Royston had nudged the tablecloth while performing generosity. If Margaret rang again, it might fall. If it fell, the laughter would become less polite. "Not entirely, Your Grace," she said. "The leg nearest the window is uneven." Portia blinked. "Oh, surely that cannot matter." "It matters if money is to be counted honestly," Margaret said. A faint silence followed. Not admiration. Not yet. Surprise. The Duke stepped forward. He did not take the bell from Margaret's hand. He did not touch her. He placed 2 fingers on the rim of the collection box and steadied the table with his other hand until a footman hurried forward to adjust the wedge beneath the leg. The gesture was small. It was also devastating. A duke had crossed a room full of eligible young women, not to flatter beauty, not to accept worship, but to prevent an unmarried woman of 40 from being made more ridiculous than she had already been made. Margaret felt heat rise behind her eyes and despised it. She had survived sharper insults than Portia's. She had endured years of being called sensible, useful, unfortunate, admirable, in that dreadful tone which meant undesirable. Yet this nearly undid her, because it was not rescue. It was recognition. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "No thanks are necessary." His eyes rested for a moment on the black notebook half hidden beneath the subscription sheet. "You are keeping 2 records." Portia gave a quick little laugh. "Miss Ellery is very fond of records. Women without households must have somewhere to put their energy." Margaret closed the notebook gently. The Duke did not look at Portia, and women with households often misplace theirs. Mrs. Royston's fan stopped moving. One of the young ladies made a sound dangerously close to a gasp. Margaret lowered her eyes, not to submit, but because if she met the Duke's gaze too long, the room would see too much. "The second record is private," she said. "Then I shall not ask to read it." That answer, more than the defense, unsettled her. Men of rank were accustomed to asking and receiving. The Duke had noticed a closed thing and let it remain closed. Portia recovered with admirable speed. "Your Grace, if you wish to contribute, Miss Ellery will be delighted to ring for you." It was meant to restore the joke. Everyone heard that. Margaret heard it. The Duke heard it too. He drew a folded bank draft from his inner pocket and placed it beside the subscription sheet. The amount was large enough to make Lady Ashburn lean forward before she could stop herself. Margaret recorded it with careful fingers. The bell waited in her hand, suddenly heavier than silver ought to be. "Shall I ring, Your Grace?" she asked. His expression did not soften exactly. Something in it deepened. "Yes, Miss Ellery," he said quietly. "Ring it once more." Portia's smile returned, triumphant too soon. Then the Duke added, "This time for the women the room has forgotten." The words fell with no ornament at all. That made them impossible to dismiss. Margaret looked at him then, truly looked. His face remained composed, but his eyes held a stillness she could not read. It was not pity. She knew pity too well to mistake it. It was attention, grave and unsettling, as if he had heard not the cracked bell, but something beneath it. Slowly, Margaret lifted her hand. The silver trembled once. Then she rang the bell. Its broken note passed through the subscription room, thin, imperfect, and clear enough to silence every laugh that had come before it. By the time the last guest had taken her gloves, her compliments, and her comfortable conscience into the Mayfair Street, the subscription room looked less like a scene of charity than the remains of a performance. Chairs stood at small angles where ladies had turned to whisper. Teacups cooled beside half-eaten cakes. The long table near the window still held the lacquered collection box, the bent silver arms, bell, the subscription sheets, and Margaret Ellery's small black notebook, closed now beneath her gloved hand as if it contained something more dangerous than ink. The Duke of Kelling-ford's donation had changed the temperature of the morning. No one had dared laugh after his remark. That did not mean the laughter had disappeared. It had merely gone underground. where London's cruelties often worked best. Lady Portia Draycott paused near the door with her rose silk skirts gathered in one elegant hand. How fortunate for the refuge that His Grace has such a generous understanding of spectacle, she said, her smile fixed upon Margaret. One must admire a gentleman who knows how to improve a dull scene. Margaret dipped her pen, although the inkpot was nearly dry. The refuge will admire the donation more than the scene, I hope. Mrs. Felicity Royston gave a soft, silvery sigh. Dear Miss Ellery, always so earnest. It must be restful to have no household claims upon one's time. All that energy may be poured into lists. Margaret did not look up. Lists are useful when memory proves selective. For a heartbeat, Mrs. Royston's fan faltered. Portia's smile thinned, but she did not answer. She had enough sense to leave a room before she lost it. When the door closed behind the last of the ladies, the silence that remained felt different from the silence the Duke had made. This one was not full of judgment. It was tired. Margaret released the breath she had been holding and opened the subscription sheets again. Across the room, 2 footmen collected cups, and an elderly committee member, Mrs. Hargreaves, counted folded notes with the anxious expression of a woman who believed arithmetic became less trustworthy in the presence of aristocracy. Margaret took up the bell and set it farther from the table's edge. The cracked clapper shifted inside with a faint, dull tick. "Poor thing," Mrs. Hargreaves murmured, seeing the motion. "It has seen better years." Margaret almost smiled. "Haven't we all?" She had not realized the Duke still stood near the mantel until he answered. "Some things are more honest after damage." The words were quiet, but they crossed the room cleanly. Margaret's hand stilled on the bell. Mrs. Hargreaves looked from one to the other, gathered the bank drafts with sudden industry, and remembered an urgent matter concerning the treasurer's satchel. Within moments, she had retreated to the adjoining office, leaving the door open by the precise width propriety required. Margaret remained standing beside the table. The Duke did not move closer. That restraint steadied her more than any gallantry could have done. "You were kind to the bell, Your Grace," she said at last. "I was not aware bells required kindness. Everything requires kindness when a room has decided to make use of it." His gaze rested briefly on the silver object, then on the closed black notebook beneath her hand. "And you, Miss Ellery, were you being made use of?" The directness should have offended her. Instead, it relieved her. Society spent so much effort pretending cruelty was wit that plain speech felt almost indecent. "I was asked to assist the refuge." That is not an answer. It is the one a woman in my position is permitted to give. He accepted that without triumph. "Your position." Margaret turned a page of the subscription list, aligning it exactly with the page beneath. "Unmarried, useful, old enough to be trusted with accounts, but apparently not old enough to be spared jokes. Poor enough to be grateful for invitations, but not poor enough to be pitied openly. I occupy a very specific corner of London. Your Grace." It is draughty, but familiar. A faint change passed through his face. "Not amusement, not quite pain. And yet you write more than figures." Margaret's fingers closed over the notebook. "I do. I will not ask to read it. I said so earlier, and I meant it." That should have ended the matter. It did not. The fact that he did not demand made the silence between them larger, and in that space Margaret heard her mother's voice with uncomfortable clarity. "A name forgotten is a life buried twice." Slowly, she slid the notebook from beneath the papers and opened it not toward him, but toward herself. "I keep a private record of the women the refuge discusses. The Duke's expression sharpened. The applicants? The women, she corrected gently. Committees prefer categories: widow, seamstress, discharged governess, fallen gentlewoman, case approved, case deferred, case unworthy. Those labels are convenient for minutes, but they make it very easy to forget that Mrs. Ada Pike once embroidered altar cloths fine enough for a bishop's chapel before her eyesight failed, or that Miss Lorna Venn taught Latin to 3 boys who now pretend they educated themselves. His eyes did not leave her face. You write their histories, only fragments, enough that they do not vanish entirely between a petition and a payment. Why? She looked down at the open page. Her own handwriting appeared severe because she had trained it to waste no space. Ada Pike, left eye failing, proud of clean seams, requested lamp oil, not pity, because money saves hunger, she said. A name saves a person from being erased. The Duke said nothing. Margaret wondered if she had said too much. There were rules for women like her. Be useful, but not intense. Be kind, but not memorable. Be intelligent, but only in service of someone else's comfort. She had broken all 3 before noon. She began to close the notebook. Forgive me. It is a habit, not a doctrine. Do not apologize for reverence. The word struck her so unexpectedly that she looked up. His voice had changed on the last syllable, lowered by something private. Most people call it sentimentality, she said. Most people are careless with words that might cost them effort. He glanced toward the open office door, where Mrs. Hargreaves could be heard asking a footman whether anyone had seen the treasurer's string-bound packet. Does the committee know you keep this record? Mrs. Hargreaves knows I make occasional notes. The others would find it uncomfortable. Because it honors the women too much. Because it would require the committee to admit that charity is not the same as attention. For the first time, the Duke's stern mouth softened almost imperceptibly. It vanished before it could become a smile. You are severe, Miss Ellery. No, Your Grace, merely accurate. Accuracy is often mistaken for severity by those who benefit from confusion. Margaret should have guarded herself. A woman did not grow to 40 unmarried in London without knowing how dangerous sympathy could be when it came from a man too far above her. Yet the Duke's attention did not feel like a hand reaching down. It felt like a lamp being set near a page she had been trying to read in the dark. She closed the notebook fully now, but without hiding it. You gave a great deal to the refuge. Mrs. Hargreaves will likely speak of it for a month. I did not give it to Mrs. Hargreaves. The answer was too quick, and the silence after it too charged. Margaret lowered her gaze to the subscription sheet. Then the women will be grateful. I did not give it for gratitude either. Outside, a carriage rattled past, wheels striking uneven stones. In the adjoining office, Mrs. Hargreaves sneezed. The ordinary sounds made the moment more dangerous, not less, because they proved it was happening in daylight, in a respectable room, with doors open and servants nearby. And still Margaret felt as if something had shifted under her feet. The Duke took a measured step toward the table, stopping at a proper distance. I gave it because when Lady Portia made that bell a jest, you made it a duty. When Mrs. Royston made charity a stage, you made it a ledger of human souls. London applauds beauty every night, Miss Ellery. It very rarely notices conscience. Heat touched Margaret's face. Conscience is not fashionable. No, his eyes held hers. But it is rare. She could not answer at once. Praise from most men felt like a coin tossed toward a beggar. This did not. It felt considered, and therefore far more difficult to bear. She reached for the sand shaker and dusted a line of ink that was already dry. "You should be careful, Your Grace. If you continue speaking so generously to a woman of my age, society may decide you have developed a taste for lost causes. Society has been wrong before luncheon many times." Against her will, a small laugh escaped her. It was not bright. It was not young. It was real, and that made the Duke look at her as if the sound had answered a question he had not yet asked. Then the outer door opened again, and Lady Portia's voice floated back into the room. She had returned for a forgotten glove, or pretended to. Her gaze moved from the Duke to Margaret, then to the black notebook on the table. Something cold and pleased entered her expression. "I hope I do not interrupt anything important." Margaret closed her hand over the notebook. The Duke's face resumed its polished stillness. "You interrupt accounts, Lady Portia. They are often important." Portia laughed lightly, but her eyes remained on Margaret's hand. "How diligent Miss Ellery is. One wonders what she writes so privately." "One does," said the Duke, "if one has poor manners." The color in Portia's cheeks sharpened. She collected a glove from a chair where Margaret was almost certain it had not been lying before. "Until tomorrow, then, Mrs. Royston is arranging a smaller committee review. I am sure Miss Ellery and all her careful little records will be indispensable." After she left, the room seemed to remember how to breathe. Margaret looked down at her notebook and felt, for the first time that morning, not merely insulted but watched, not by the Duke, by something meaner, hungrier. "She noticed," Margaret said. "Yes," he replied, "and so did I." She met his gaze. "Those are not the same thing." "No," the Duke said quietly, "they are not." In the corridor beyond the closed door, Portia's footsteps faded, but the danger she carried did not fade with them. It had found a shape now, a woman with no husband, no fortune of consequence, and a private book of names. By tomorrow, London would begin deciding what such a woman could be accused of wanting. 3 days after the subscription breakfast, Margaret Ellery learned that a room did not need a bell to make a woman feel publicly summoned. Draycott House stood in Mayfair with its polished brass knocker, cream-stone steps, and windows, bright enough to reflect every carriage that paused before it. Margaret arrived just after noon with her aunt, Mrs. Penrose, whose stiff knees and sharper eyes had made her a useful chaperone for 20 years. The invitation had come folded in thick paper and written in Lady Portia Draycott's elegant hand. A small committee review, it had said, a necessary discussion regarding refuge dignity and donor confidence. Margaret had read that phrase twice. Donor confidence. In charitable circles, it was often the polite name for suspicion. She should have refused. Yet refusal would have travelled faster than attendance, and by now she understood that Lady Portia did not invite without purpose. A woman who stayed away from a room was easily described by those inside it. So Margaret went. She wore the dove-grey gown again, because she owned nothing finer that was suitable for a morning call. At her throat, she pinned her mother's black jet brooch. Though the clasp had grown weak over the last year and required careful fastening, the brooch was oval, plain, and unfashionable compared with the bright cameos and jeweled pins younger ladies wore. Beneath its glass rested a small lock of her mother's dark hair, faded now toward brown. Margaret touched it once before entering the drawing room. Not for luck. Her mother had never approved of luck. For steadiness, Lady Portia received her with a warmth so practiced that it chilled. "Miss Ellery, how good of you to come. And Mrs. Penrose, of course. We were only speaking of the refuge. Then I am relieved to have arrived before accuracy suffered. Mrs. Penrose said, lowering herself onto a chair with the expression of a general selecting ground. Portia's lashes flickered. Margaret nearly smiled. Mrs. Royston sat near the tea table, dressed in lavender silk, mourning reduced to an art. Two younger ladies occupied a sofa, both watching Margaret with the eager discomfort of girls who had been told they were about to witness something instructive. On the far side of the room, beside the marble mantel, Lord Anselm Draycott stood with one hand resting upon a chair back. He had Portia's pale colouring and none of her brightness. His smile looked borrowed. "Miss Ellery," he said, "London has been full of your industry. London is often full of things less useful," Margaret replied. Portia laughed before the answer could settle too firmly. "We all admire usefulness, truly. But one must be careful, mustn't one? A lady's zeal can be misunderstood when it exceeds her station." Margaret accepted tea and did not drink it. "My station at the refuge is to keep the subscription record accurate, and other records, I hear," Mrs. Royston said lightly. Mrs. Penrose's eyes moved at once to Margaret, but Margaret kept her face calm. "I make notes when necessary." "How admirable," Portia said, "though private notes about unfortunate women may strike some as rather intimate. One hopes they are not sentimental." One of the younger ladies looked down quickly, hiding a smile. Margaret felt the old familiar pressure behind her ribs. Do not defend too much. Do not expose too much. A woman like her could be condemned for secrecy and laughed at for sincerity in the same breath. "Sentimentality is feeling without duty," she said. "I try to avoid it." "How severe." Portia's gaze fell to the brooch at Margaret's throat. "Perhaps severity becomes inevitable after a certain age. Even one's ornaments begin to look like memorial tablets." Mrs. Royston sighed. "Dear Lady Portia, you are wicked." "Not wicked, observant." Portia leaned forward as if bestowing a confidence. "That little brooch, Miss Ellery. It gives you such an air of permanent mourning. Though perhaps it is not mourning, perhaps it is expectation disappointed into jewelry." Silence gathered, soft and satisfied. Margaret's hand rose before she could stop it, not to hide the brooch, but to steady it. "It belonged to my mother." "Ah." Portia's expression arranged itself into regret. "Then I must not tease. Mothers are sacred, even when their daughters become relics before them." Mrs. Penrose's teacup met its saucer with a sharp click. "Lady Portia, in my day young women were taught that cruelty did not become prettier when spoken softly." Portia's cheeks warmed, but she smiled. "How fortunate, Mrs. Penrose, that we live in a progressive age." "Not noticeably," Mrs. Penrose said. The drawing-room door opened before Portia could answer. The butler announced the Duke of Kelling-ford, and every back in the room altered. It was remarkable, Margaret thought, how rank could correct posture faster than conscience. Everard Kelling-ford entered in a dark morning coat, his hat and gloves handed off with economical precision. If he was surprised to find Margaret there, he did not show it. His gaze moved from Portia to Mrs. Royston, to Anselm, then to Margaret. It paused there only long enough to be noticed by everyone who wished it had not. "Lady Portia," he said, "your note mentioned a question regarding refuge patronage." "Yes, Your Grace. We are so grateful you came. We were only discussing the delicate matter of how the refuge presents itself. Reputation is everything in benevolent work. Reputation is often what people discuss when they prefer not to discuss conduct." The words were mild. Anselm's fingers tightened on the chair back. Margaret lowered her eyes to her untouched tea, but not before she saw the faintest satisfaction pass through Mrs. Penrose's face. Portia recovered. "Then we are agreed," Conduct matters. Miss Ellery has been most energetic, perhaps too energetic for her own comfort. Miss Ellery may speak for her own comfort, the Duke said. It was not a rescue. It was a door opened. Margaret took it. I am comfortable with work, Your Grace, less so with implications. Implications? That to remember a poor woman's name is to trespass upon her privacy. That to keep accurate figures is to exceed my place. That to remain unmarried long enough is to make every serious act look like compensation for personal failure. The last words left her before caution could stop them. The room went still. Margaret felt the cost at once. She had said too much. Worse, she had said it clearly. Lady Portia's eyes brightened, not with shame but with opportunity. My dear Miss Ellery, no one said failure. No, Margaret replied. You all have better manners than that. Something changed in the Duke's expression. Respect, perhaps, or anger held on her behalf. Either was dangerous. Margaret reached for her cup, needing an ordinary gesture, but her glove brushed the weakened clasp at her throat. The black jet brooch slipped free. It struck the edge of the saucer, glanced off the small table, and fell to the carpet. The tiny sound seemed louder than it should have been. Margaret bent at once. So did the Duke. Their hands reached the brooch at the same moment. They did not touch, not quite. His fingers stopped a breath from hers, close enough for her to feel the warmth of his hand through the narrow space between them. Margaret froze. The room, the tea, Portia's pale smile, Anselm's watchful face, all of it receded into the startling awareness of that almost touch. She was 40 years old. She was not a girl startled by the brush of a sleeve. She knew the difference between vanity and feeling. Yet the nearness of his hand unsettled her because he had stopped. A careless man would have taken the brooch and made a gallant display of returning it. The Duke waited, allowing her the right to reclaim what was hers. Margaret picked up the brooch. The clasp hung crooked, but the glass had not cracked. Beneath it, her mother's hair remained undisturbed. Thank you, Your Grace, she said, though he had not touched the object. For what? His voice was low enough that only those nearest could hear. For not assuming. His eyes met hers. I am trying to make a habit of it. The words should have been nothing. They were not nothing. Margaret rose, and he rose with her, maintaining exactly the distance propriety required. Lady Portia looked from one to the other, her expression sharpened by the realization that restraint could be more intimate than flirtation. How fortunate the brooch survived, Portia said. Such attachments are difficult to replace at Miss Ellery's time of life. Margaret fastened the brooch again, with hands that had nearly steadied. My mother taught me that no woman is finished because others stop expecting her happiness. The sentence settled over the room with a weight no one immediately knew how to lift. The Duke looked at the brooch, then back at Margaret's face. Your mother was wise. She had little choice. Wisdom was less expensive than comfort. Mrs. Penrose made a small approving sound. Mrs. Royston looked displeased. Portia's smile returned, but now it had an edge of calculation. What a moving sentiment, Mrs. Royston. We must remember it when preparing the committee correction. London does love a touching phrase, especially when it can be placed in the proper context. Margaret heard the warning beneath the silk. So did the Duke. What correction? He asked. Portia lifted her brows. Only a small printed clarification about the refuge's record-keeping. Donna's dislike confusion. Then do not create any. The room cooled. Anselm stepped forward before Portia could answer. Your Grace, surely transparency protects everyone, even Miss Ellery. Transparency does not begin with insinuation, Lord Anselm. The Duke's tone remained even, which made the rebuke worse. Margaret touched the brooch once more, feeling the loosened clasp beneath her glove. She should have felt humiliated by its fall. Instead, she felt exposed in a stranger way. The Duke had seen the small relic she carried. He had seen the hair under glass, the poor clasp, the private grief. Portia had tried to cheapen, and he had not pitied it. He had honored it with silence. That was the second thing he had given her. The first had been the bell rung without mockery. This was more dangerous. A bell belonged to a room. The brooch belonged to her heart. When Margaret and Mrs. Penrose rose to leave, the Duke did not offer more attention than propriety allowed. He bowed. Miss Ellery, your Grace. Nothing in the exchange could be quoted. Nothing improper had occurred. Yet as Margaret passed into the corridor, she felt the near touch still hovering over her hand like a question. Behind her, in the drawing room, Portia's voice resumed its sweetness. Felicity, send for the printer this afternoon. If Miss Ellery insists on being remembered, we must be sure London remembers her correctly. The Refuge Committee room had never looked dangerous before. It occupied the second floor of a narrow building off a respectable square, with tall windows that admitted more grey London light than warmth, a coal grate that smoked when the wind turned, and shelves crowded with ledgers, petitions, stitched linen bundles, and boxes of donated clothing tied with string. No one entering it would have imagined that reputations could be injured among such plain furniture. Yet 3 days after the morning call at Draycott House, Margaret Ellery stood at the long oak table with the subscription sheets spread before her and felt danger gather in the ink. The morning had begun ordinarily enough. Mrs. Hargreaves had unlocked the cabinet, complained of the dust, and set the lacquered collection box beside the bent silver arms bell, which had been returned from the subscription breakfast and still leaned slightly on its stem. The bell's cracked clapper shifted whenever the table moved, making a small dull sound like a warning swallowed before it became speech. Margaret noticed at once that the bell had not been placed exactly where she had left it after the Duke steadied the table. That was not impossible. Servants moved objects. Committee ladies rearranged everything they did not understand. Still, she looked twice. The black jet brooch at her throat had been repaired by Mrs. Penrose's old maid that morning. The clasp tightened with a discreet twist of wire. It felt secure now, though Margaret had touched it more than once on the carriage ride, remembering the moment at Draycott House when the Duke of Kelling-ford had bent at the same time she had, then stopped his hand before taking what was hers. A man could reveal himself in what he chose not to touch. That thought had troubled her more than Portia's insult. "Miss Ellery, are you attending?" Mrs. Hargreaves asked. "Yes, forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive. I wish half the committee attended as well when figures are concerned." Mrs. Hargreaves pushed a stack of folded notes toward her. Lady Portia sent revised names for next week's subscription assembly. Mrs. Royston sent opinions. "I prefer names." "So do I," Margaret said. The older lady's mouth twitched. They worked for nearly an hour. Margaret entered, promised donations, confirmed sums received, and checked each name against the earlier sheet. Most of the numbers agreed. Some did not. At first, the differences were small enough to blame upon haste. A shilling missing from one line, 6pence added to another, a lady credited with a guinea, when Margaret distinctly remembered hearing the bell after 2 sovereigns had been placed into the box. She turned back to her own notes. not the private black notebook of names, but the official rough tally she had kept during the breakfast. Every time she had rung the bell, she had marked the donor and amount. She had done it because accuracy was easier to defend than dignity. The official list now disagreed with her tally in 7 places. "Mrs. Hargreaves," she said quietly, "did anyone reconcile the box before today?" "Only Mr. Noyes looked in yesterday afternoon. Lord Anselm brought him. They said it would save us trouble before the treasurer came." Margaret lifted her head. "Mr. Noyes had the box, not away from the building, I believe, only in the downstairs room. Why? Is something amiss?" Before Margaret could answer, the door opened, and Lord Anselm Draycott entered as if summoned by the thought of his name. He wore a pale waistcoat, a courteous smile, and the air of a man who considered any room improved by his permission to enter it. "Mrs. Hargreaves, Miss Ellery, how industrious you both are." Mrs. Hargreaves's expression cooled. "Lord Anselm, this is a working morning. Then I am fortunate to find working ladies." His gaze moved to the sheets before Margaret. "My sister asked me to inquire whether the subscription record is ready for circulation. Donors are anxious to see proper acknowledgement." Margaret set her pen down. Proper acknowledgement requires proper figures. Indeed, he approached the table. "Which is why I wondered whether it might be kinder to relieve you of the duty, Miss Ellery. London can be ungenerous. A lady whose name has lately been tied to so much intimate record-keeping should not be burdened with further scrutiny. I do not find accuracy a burden. No, how admirable." Anselm's smile deepened. "Still, there are perceptions to consider." Mrs. Hargreaves closed the ledger with more force than necessary. "Perceptions do not add columns, my lord. But they influence donors, madam. And donors keep doors open." He looked back at Margaret. "You must see the difficulty. A woman without household claims may devote herself with unusual fervor to a cause. That fervor can be mistaken." Margaret felt the insult land precisely where it had been aimed, not at her work, at the emptiness society insisted on seeing around it. No husband, no children, no house of her own. Therefore, any serious attention she gave the world must be unnatural, hungry, suspect. "Mistaken by whom?" she asked. Anselm's lifted one shoulder. "Those less charitable than I. Then I shall be grateful for your charity when I meet it." Mrs. Hargreaves made a sound that might have been a cough. Anselm's eyes hardened briefly, then softened into something worse. "Miss Ellery, I am trying to protect you. There are whispers already. Mrs. Royston fears that some ladies consider you rather possessive of the refuse records. Names, tallies, private notes. It creates an impression. The impression that I can write. The impression that you require importance." Margaret looked at the official subscription sheet, then at the rough tally in her own hand. The discrepancy between them seemed suddenly less like error and more like bait. "Importance is not what I require, Lord Anselm. Accuracy protects women who have no power. If a seamstress is promised lamp oil, and the lamp oil is not bought, she sits in darkness. If a widow is granted lodging, and the coin goes missing, she sleeps where she can. The ladies at the top of the page may forget a shilling. The women at the bottom cannot." The door had opened while she spoke. She did not notice until Anselm's attention shifted past her shoulder and his face altered by a fraction. Margaret turned. The Duke of Kelling-ford stood in the doorway with his hat in one hand and a packet of correspondence in the other. His presence changed the room exactly as it had before, not by noise, but by weight. Mrs. Hargreaves rose halfway from her chair. "Your Grace." "Mrs. Hargreaves." His gaze went to Margaret, then to Anselm, then to the sheets spread between them. I was told the patron letters required signature. They do, Mrs. Hargreaves said, and perhaps a spine as well. Margaret kept her eyes on the ledger because looking at the Duke too soon would betray how deeply relieved she was. Relief was unsafe. It could look like dependence to those eager to name it so. Lord Anselm believes I should be relieved of account duties, she said. The Duke came no farther than the edge of the table. Does Miss Ellery wish to be relieved? No, Margaret said. Then I fail to see the question. Anselm laughed lightly. Your Grace, surely you understand that public confidence may require more than personal preference. Public confidence requires transparent accounts. The Duke set the packet down, not the removal of the one person in the room who appears to have noticed a discrepancy. Silence followed. Margaret looked up then. He had not asked whether there was a discrepancy. He had read the table, the open sheets, the duplicated columns, and perhaps her face. Several figures do not agree, she said. Small sums only. Small sums are useful to thieves because pride prevents respectable people from noticing them. Anselm's colour shifted. Thieves, Your Grace, that is a strong word for a clerical confusion. Then let us avoid it by having the records examined. The Duke turned to Margaret. Would you object to an independent tradesman reviewing the box, the bell, and the tally? A reputable silversmith can inspect the fittings. A clerk from my steward's office can compare copies. If you consent. If you consent. The words moved quietly through Margaret. He could have ordered. He could have overwhelmed the room with rank and called it assistance. Instead, he placed the choice before her where everyone could see it. That did more to steady her than any declaration of trust. I would not object, she said, but I would prefer the refugee's own copies remain here until Mrs. Hargreaves has sealed them. Mrs. Hargreaves nodded, sensible. The Duke's eyes held Margaret's for one measured beat. Very sensible. It was not flirtation. It was worse for being cleaner than flirtation. Admiration, given without ornament, could enter more deeply than praise. Margaret felt it and looked away first. Anselm's smile had become thin. You make a great matter of very little. Then you will be relieved when little comes of it, the Duke said. Mrs. Hargreaves reached for ribbon and sealing wax. Margaret gathered the sheets in order. The bent silver bell remained beside the lacquered box, dull and crooked in the weak morning light. As Margaret lifted it to clear space, the clapper gave its cracked tick again. She frowned. It seemed heavier than it had at the breakfast, though perhaps that was fancy. Anselm noticed the movement. Careful, Miss Ellery. We would not want the bell damaged while in your hands. The sentence was mild. The warning beneath it was not. Margaret set the bell down slowly. No, she said, we would not want that. The Duke's gaze moved from the bell to Anselm, and the room grew cold enough for even Mrs. Hargreaves to stop tying ribbon. By the end of the hour, the records were sealed, the official sheets locked in the cabinet, and the bell returned to the table under Mrs. Hargreaves's eye. Yet, as Margaret drew on her gloves to leave, Mrs. Royston's voice drifted up from the stairwell below, bright with performance and meant to be overheard. I only say that unmarried ladies can grow possessive over causes. Without a household, where else is all that feeling to go? Margaret paused with one glove half buttoned. The Duke, standing near the door, heard it too. His jaw tightened, but he did not speak for her. He waited. That restraint called forth her courage more effectively than defense. Margaret finished buttoning her glove. Into accuracy, Mrs. Royston, she called clearly toward the stair. That is where mine goes. No answer came. only the soft retreat of skirts below. Mrs. Hargreaves smiled at the ledger. The Duke opened the door for Margaret and Mrs. Penrose without touching either of them. As Margaret passed, he said quietly, "London is unaccustomed to accuracy. Then London must improve its habits. I hope," he said, "to witness the lesson." She should not have carried those words with her into the carriage. She did. Behind them, in the committee room, the bent silver bell sat beside the sealed records, still in refuge possession, still cracked, still waiting. Before nightfall, someone would ask to have it cleaned, and because the request would sound harmless, no one would think to refuse. The week after the committee accounts were sealed, the Ladies' Benevolent Refuge opened its reading room for inspection, and Margaret Ellery arrived with the uncomfortable knowledge that nothing in London remained harmless. Once Lady Portia Draycott had noticed it. The room itself was modest enough to be overlooked by any lady who entered only to be seen leaving. It occupied the rear of the refuge building, where the street noise thinned and the windows looked over a narrow yard filled with damp brick, a struggling lilac bush, and 3 lines of clean linen lifted by a restless wind. Shelves lined one wall, holding donated books with cracked spines, sermons no one had asked for, old primers, a few volumes of poetry, and practical manuals on sewing, household accounts, and letter writing. Near the hearth stood a table where women might sit, without being stared at while they read, copied advertisements, or wrote to relations who had perhaps forgotten them less completely than they feared. Margaret came with Mrs. Penrose, whose knees protested the stairs, but whose pride would have refused a chair until one was offered by proper authority. Mrs. Hargreaves fussed over the fire, apologized for the smell of damp wool from the donation bundles, and explained that the alms bell had been sent out the previous evening to be cleaned, only for polishing, she said, as if Margaret had accused her. Lord Anselm was most insistent that the bell look respectable for next week's larger assembly. He said donors like visible order. Margaret removed her gloves slowly. Did he take the collection box as well? No, no. I would not permit that. The box remains in the cabinet. The bell alone was sent with his man. The answer should have comforted her. It did not. A bell was not money. A bell could not alter a total, and yet she remembered its odd heaviness, the way Lord Anselm had watched her lift it, the mild warning in his voice. We would not want the bell damaged while in your hands. Then we must hope visible order returns promptly. Mrs. Penrose settled into a chair near the hearth and narrowed her eyes. Hope is what people recommend when they wish to avoid responsibility. Mrs. Hargreaves looked startled, then thoughtful. Before Margaret could answer, footsteps sounded in the passage, and the Duke of Kelling-ford entered with his hat in hand and a plain packet tucked beneath one arm. He had the air of a man who had already declined several more decorative invitations that morning. His gaze found Margaret at once, not with surprise, but with a steadiness that made the little room feel less shabby and more exact. Mrs. Hargreaves, Mrs. Penrose, Miss Ellery. Margaret curtsied. Your Grace. Mrs. Penrose inclined her head and said, You have chosen a damp room for a ducal visit. Damp rooms often need patrons more than dry drawing rooms do, he replied. Mrs. Penrose's mouth twitched with approval. Mrs. Hargreaves, relieved to have rank approving the premises rather than criticizing them, began showing him the shelves, the account drawer, and the table, where applicants might read notices for employment. Margaret stayed near the smaller desk, where her black notebook lay closed beside a stack of petitions. She had not meant to bring it out, yet she had been copying names from old case sheets into it because the official files reduced entire lives to brief phrases that made suffering convenient. Widow, aged 32, 2 children, needlewoman, partial sight. Governess, no reference. Respectable, if quiet. Not quite respectable, but penitent. The language pricked her like burrs. Miss Ellery, Mrs. Hargreaves called. Perhaps you might explain the reading list. You arranged it better than I did. Margaret crossed the room. The Duke stepped aside to give her space. A small courtesy that she now knew was deliberate. He did not crowd. He did not possess a room, simply because every room offered itself to him. The women most often ask for 3 kinds of books, Margaret said. Practical instruction, because hunger makes romance difficult. Letters and forms, because work requires one to ask properly for what one ought not have to beg for. And poetry, though the committee sometimes pretends not to notice that. Why pretend? He asked. Because poetry implies they have souls beyond their usefulness. His eyes rested on her face. And do they? Your Grace, she said softly. Usefulness is the smallest part of a soul. The words came without calculation. Once spoken, they seemed to remain between them, as visible as breath in winter. Mrs. Hargreaves had turned to direct a servant with a coal scuttle. Mrs. Penrose was examining the hearth tiles with studied disinterest. For a brief moment, Margaret and the Duke stood inside a privacy made not by closed doors, but by everyone else's tact. He looked toward the black notebook on the desk. Is that where you keep them? Some of them. The women, their names. A few facts, sometimes a sentence, if there is one worth preserving. May I ask for one? It was the asking that undid her again. He had asked before looking at her notebook. He asked now before receiving even a name. Margaret crossed to the desk and opened the book. She did not turn it toward him. Not yet. Her finger found the page she had copied that morning. Eliza Mornay, she read. Seamstress. 36, though she allowed the committee to think 40 because she believed older suffering sounded more respectable. Worked 14 years in a Bond Street workroom. Could embroider seed pearls on satin without pricking the cloth. Died last winter after refusing a physician so her niece might keep the fee for rent. The room quieted around the name. The servant with the coal scuttle paused near the door. Mrs. Hargreaves lowered her eyes. Even Mrs. Penrose stopped pretending not to listen. Margaret continued, because stopping would have felt like failing the woman a second time. She asked for lamp oil, broth, and 2 sheets of writing paper. The committee granted oil and broth. The writing paper was marked unnecessary. Was it? The Duke asked. Her niece said she wished to write one last letter to a sister in Bath. Margaret closed the notebook with care. So I have written her name here, since no letter went where it ought to have gone. The Duke did not answer immediately. His face had gone very still, not the public stillness he wore in crowded rooms, but something more inward, less armored. When he spoke, his voice had lost a little of its ducal polish. My sister's name was Beatrice. Margaret looked up. He had not mentioned a sister before. She knew the name only as one society spoke in lowered tones when tragedy was old enough to be tasteful. Lady Beatrice Kelling-ford. A scandal rumored, an illness hinted, a death softened into phrases. Was? She asked gently. She died 5 years ago. I am sorry. Many people were sorry. His mouth tightened. Very few remembered her accurately. Margaret did not move. This was not a confidence to seize. It was a door opened only an inch, and she knew the violence of pushing. Would you like me to know anything true about her? She asked. The question seemed to strike him more deeply than any expression of sympathy. He looked toward the window, where grey light lay over the damp yard. She laughed at solemn music. She could not keep a secret from a dog. She embroidered badly and insisted the fault lay with the needle. She was kinder than the story London kept. Margaret let the silence settle after each fact, as if receiving something fragile. Then she opened the notebook again, turned to a clean space near the back, and did not write. Not without permission. May I say her name? The Duke's gaze returned to her. Yes. Beatrice, Margaret said. Only that. No title, no scandal, no explanation. The name entered the little reading room and stood there unashamed. The Duke's hand tightened around the packet he carried. For a moment, Margaret thought he might speak again. Instead, he drew a breath, slow and controlled, and bowed his head once. It was the smallest motion. It contained grief. It contained gratitude. It contained danger of another kind, because Margaret felt it answer something in herself she had not known was waiting. She was not young. She was not foolish. She did not imagine that a duke's sorrow made him hers to comfort. Yet as he looked at her, she understood that he had not merely pitied her among cruel women or admired her accuracy among careless ledgers. He had seen the part of her that gathered names against erasure, and he had brought his own dead to that quiet altar. Mrs. Hargreaves cleared her throat, brisk, because emotion embarrassed her. The reading room will do well, I think, if the committee leaves it alone. Then I shall help ensure it remains open, the Duke said. Margaret closed the notebook. Even if some ladies find poetry excessive, especially then. A light knock came at the door before Mrs. Hargreaves could answer. A maid entered with a folded note on a tray. From Lady Portia Draycott, ma'am. For Mrs. Hargreaves. A reminder about the private book Miss Ellery keeps. The words were delivered innocently. Their effect was not innocent at all. Margaret felt the room's warmth recede. Mrs. Hargreaves took the note and looked stricken before she even opened it. The Duke's expression cooled into the hard restraint London knew better. Margaret placed one hand over the black notebook. It was not fear that moved her fingers. It was recognition. Portia had found the shape of the weapon now. She would not attack the book because it held lies. She would attack it because it held names, and names could be made to sound like secrets in any room eager enough to condemn them. By the middle of June, the first printed whisper reached the refuge before the bell did. It came folded into the Morning Post between a coal merchant's account and a note from a lady in Belgravia who wished to donate 6 worn blankets provided her name appeared correctly in the next committee circular. Mrs. Hargreaves opened it without suspicion, read 2 lines, and sat down so abruptly that the chair gave a small crack of protest beneath her. Margaret, who had been sorting employment notices at the far table, looked up at once. The reading room had changed since the Duke's visit. Not visibly, perhaps, the same damp light entered through the rear windows. The same shelves leaned under the weight of practical books and neglected poetry. But something in the room had acquired importance. 2 women had come that morning to copy advertisements for needlework. A former governess sat near the hearth with a primer open before her, her lips moving silently, as she practiced the phrases required to ask for a position without sounding desperate. Margaret had entered 3 more names into her black notebook before breakfast and had locked it in her reticule afterward, not because she was ashamed of it, but because Lady Portia's note had taught her that innocence did not protect a thing once malice had named it interesting. "Mrs. Hargreaves?" she asked. The older woman folded the paper too late. Her expression had already confessed trouble. "Nonsense," she said. "Printed nonsense. There is always some." Mrs. Penrose, who had accompanied Margaret and was engaged in glaring a loose thread back into submission on one of the donated blankets, held out her hand. "I have a healthy appetite for nonsense when it arrives before luncheon." Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated. Margaret crossed the room and received the folded sheet herself. It was cheaply printed, the ink a little blurred along the edges. The sort of thing passed from reticule to tea table, never dignified enough to claim an author, and never honest enough to require one. The heading read, "A necessary caution regarding female vanity in charitable work." Margaret felt no shock at first. Shock required surprise. She read steadily. The circular did not name her outright. It did not need to. It described a certain unmarried gentlewoman of advancing years who had attached herself with singular intensity to the private sufferings of women receiving assistance. It wondered whether case histories were being preserved for benevolent purposes or for the nourishment of a barren social imagination. It suggested that donors deserved confidence that their gifts were not being used to create a little kingdom of pity for a lady whose own domestic prospects had long since closed. The room did not move. The former governess had stopped turning pages. One of the seamstresses stared down at her hands. Mrs. Hargreaves whispered, "It is vile." Margaret folded the sheet along its original crease. Her fingers were calm. That seemed to frighten Mrs. Hargreaves more than tears would have done. "It is careful," Margaret said. "Vileness often is." Mrs. Penrose rose with difficulty. "Give it to me. I shall burn it." "No." The word left Margaret quietly, but it held. Mrs. Penrose looked at her. Margaret kept the paper in her hand. "If we burn it, the next person may say we feared it." "The next person deserves my cane across her ankles," Mrs. Penrose said. "That is a sound policy for private satisfaction, but perhaps not for public persuasion." A faint, unwilling laugh escaped the former governess near the hearth. Margaret turned toward her and softened her voice. "Miss Bell, you need not stay if this makes the room uncomfortable." The woman lifted her chin. She was not young, though she was not yet old enough for society to stop demanding gratitude from her. "I have been made uncomfortable in finer rooms than this, Miss Ellery. I would rather stay where someone says the thing plainly." The answer entered Margaret more deeply than praise. She nodded once, then looked again at the circular. "Mrs. Hargreaves, who else received it?" "Lady Portia, Mrs. Royston, Mrs. Vale, the treasurer, and I fear several donors. It was enclosed with no seal." Then it was meant to multiply. The door opened before Mrs. Hargreaves could answer. Everard Kelling-ford entered with a chill in his face that belonged less to the weather than to the paper already in his hand. He held the same circular. His gaze went first to Margaret, then to the women in the room, then to the sheet she carried. "You have seen it." "Yes, Your Grace." "Who brought it?" "The post." "Who has read it?" Margaret did not answer at once. She turned slightly, acknowledging the women present without exposing them. The Duke understood before she spoke. He lowered his voice. "Forgive me. I should have asked whether anyone here wished to be free of the discussion." Miss Bell closed her primer. "I don't wish to be free of it, Your Grace. I wish to know whether a lady may write my name without being punished for believing I have one." The Duke looked at her with the grave courtesy that had first unsettled Margaret. "She may, Miss Bell, and if I have any influence in the matter, she shall." There was warmth in that, dangerous warmth. Margaret felt it like a lamp too close to paper. The Duke turned back to her. This circular must be suppressed. I can have every copy collected before evening. Printers can be found. Donors can be warned not to repeat it. Mrs. Hargreaves breathed out in relief. Mrs. Penrose looked as if she approved of the efficiency. Margaret did not. She heard the intention beneath his words. Protection, immediate, powerful, and wrong. No, Your Grace. The Duke went still. No. If the copies disappear by your order, society will say there was truth in them, and that your rank buried it. Let society say what it likes after it loses the means to circulate poison. It never loses the means. It only changes cups. His hand tightened slightly around the paper. You would allow this to spread? It has already spread. The question is whether truth follows it or silence does. For the first time since she had known him, impatience broke the surface of his restraint. It was not directed cruelly at her, but it stood between them all the same. Miss Ellery, there is a difference between courage and permitting yourself to be struck in public. I have been struck in public since I was 25, Your Grace. First by sympathy, then by advice, then by jokes, lately by bells and printed cautions. I know the shape of it. That is precisely why I would stop this. And I am telling you that stopping it out of sight will not restore what was injured in sight. The room fell silent. It was not the crisp silence of social shock. It was heavier because the disagreement had touched something true in both of them. The Duke looked at her as if he wished to answer and feared the answer would reveal more than he intended. Margaret saw, behind the controlled eyes and perfect coat, the brother who had spoken Beatrice's name in a damp reading room, a man who had lost someone to a society that remembered scandal better than kindness. Of course he wished to stop harm before it breathed. Of course he mistrusted rooms, yet if he closed this one for her, even gently, he would make her smaller to save her from being wounded. Your Grace, she said, more softly, I know you mean to help. Do you? Yes. Yes, his gaze sharpened at the honesty. Then let me. Not by hiding the evidence of their cruelty, not by making my defense invisible. A sound came from the passage outside. Skirts. A murmur. Then Mrs. Royston appeared in the doorway, wearing a lavender bonnet and an expression of delicate alarm. Lady Portia stood beside her, pale rose ribbons trembling with every satisfied breath. Oh, Mrs. Royston said. We did not know the room was occupied by so many. You knew exactly enough, Mrs. Penrose said. Portia ignored her. Her eyes dropped to the circular in Margaret's hand, then to the Duke's. How unfortunate. These things do travel. One never knows who begins them. One often knows who benefits, Margaret said. Portia's lips parted in a small, wounded smile. Miss Ellery, I hope you don't imagine I would encourage anything unkind. I only worry that private records may trouble donors. Women in distress deserve dignity. Yes, Margaret said. That is why I write their names, or why you collect them. The words were soft. They landed hard. The former governess stood. She was trembling, but she stood. Miss Ellery asked my leave before writing mine. Portia looked at her as one looked at furniture that had spoken out of turn. How moving. The Duke took one step forward. Margaret saw the decision in him before he spoke. He would end it. He could freeze Portia with rank, scatter felicity with a sentence, silence the circular by force of name and fear. Part of Margaret wanted him to. That was the shameful truth. It would be so easy to stand behind power and feel the room become safe. She looked at him and shook her head once. Not much, only enough. He saw. His jaw tightened. He did not speak. The restraint cost him. She could see that too. Margaret faced Portia. If donors are concerned, the committee may review my work openly. The names in my private book will remain private unless the women themselves consent. The official accounts may be examined against the subscription tallies. I welcome accuracy, Mrs. Royston laughed lightly. How brave, or how confident. Those are often confused by people who prefer fear. Portia's eyes gleamed. Then you will not object to ringing the bell again at next week's assembly. A public demonstration of confidence. Mrs. Hargreaves stiffened. Margaret thought of the bent silver bell, still away, being polished by a man sent through Anselm. She thought of the altered figures. She thought of the collection box locked in the cabinet, and of small sums that could be moved easily enough to stain a woman whose poverty made suspicion convenient. No, she said, I will not object. The Duke turned his head toward her. The question in his eyes was sharp, private, and full of warning. Margaret answered it without words. If danger was coming through the bell, then the bell must return to the room where everyone could hear it. Portia smiled. Excellent. She and Mrs. Royston left with the satisfaction of women who believed they had arranged a stage. After they were gone, the Duke looked at the circular in his hand as if he would gladly crush it into dust. They are preparing something. Yes, and you mean to stand there while they do it? I mean to stand there when they fail. His eyes lifted to hers. The anger in him did not vanish, but it changed direction, not away from her, around her. Then I will stand where you permit me. Margaret's breath caught so slightly that no one but herself could have known. It was not a touch, it was not a vow, yet it was the first time a powerful man had offered his presence as something she might govern. Then stand close enough to hear, she said, but not close enough to answer for me. As you wish. Outside the reading room, a carriage rolled past and the windows shivered. Somewhere in the city, the bent silver bell was being polished, altered, or prepared. When it returned, it would not sound as it had before. Margaret felt that with a certainty colder than proof, but she also knew this. The next time London asked her to ring it, she would listen not only to the crack in the clapper, but to the lie hidden beneath the sound. By the last week of June, the returned bell had acquired a shine that made Margaret distrust it more. It sat on the long subscription table beneath the high windows of the assembly room, polished so brightly that the bent rim caught every candle and made it tremble. Its clapper no longer gave the thin, cracked note she remembered from the first breakfast. When Mrs. Hargreaves lifted it before the guests arrived, it answered with a duller weight, as if the sound had been wrapped in cloth. It looks improved, Mrs. Hargreaves said, though her expression suggested improvement could be a suspicious virtue. Margaret stood beside her with the official tally sheets arranged in exact order, her black notebook locked in her reticule, and her mother's brooch fastened securely at her throat. It sounds different. Polish changes many things, Mrs. Hargreaves murmured. Often for the worse, Mrs. Penrose said from the chair reserved for her near the wall. Margaret looked toward the collection box. It had remained in the refuge cabinet since the accounts were sealed, but this morning Lord Anselm Draycott had arrived early with 2 footmen, claiming Lady Portia had ordered the table reset to make the donations more visible. The lacquered box had been placed beneath the bell on a small silver-mounted stand. Margaret had not seen before. It was elegant, too elegant. A charitable object made newly theatrical always made her cautious. The room filled quickly. Ladies came in muslin and silk, gentlemen in dark coats, clergymen with careful expressions, and patrons who wished their benevolence recorded before witnesses. Mrs. Royston moved among them in lavender, her voice drifting like perfume. Lady Portia stood near the donation table, all pale ribbons and triumph, accepting compliments as though she had invented mercy. The Duke of Kelling-ford entered after the first quarter hour, not early enough to direct the room, not late enough to miss it. His gaze found Margaret immediately, then moved to the bell. She saw him notice what she had noticed: the changed weight, the altered shine, the small new stand. He did not speak. Across the room, Portia smiled. "Miss Ellery, we are all so comforted that you did not object to assisting us again. It shows such admirable confidence." Margaret placed her hand beside the tally sheet. "Confidence is less useful than accuracy, Lady Portia. I shall keep to that." A few guests heard and shifted. Everard's expression did not change, but she felt his attention steady on her like a hand at her back without touching. The donations began. Lady Ashburn gave first, then Mrs. Vale, then a retired colonel's widow who placed 2 half-sovereigns into the slot with trembling fingers, and whispered that she had once nearly needed such a refuge herself. Margaret wrote each sum plainly. She rang the bell after every donation, because refusing would give Portia the scene she wanted. The bell answered with that wrong, muffled tone. Once, twice, 7 times, 12. Each sound travelled through the assembly room, not as a call, but as a secret being swallowed. Margaret marked every ring. She also marked each donor. She did not open the black notebook. Not here, not before those eyes. Lord Anselm watched from near the mantel, his pleasant face arranged into bland concern. Mr. Wilfred Noyes stood beside him, murmuring occasionally into his ear. Margaret knew Noyes by reputation as a man of business who served committees, small trusts, and families who preferred awkward matters to be handled without noise. He had the soft hands of a man who never lifted anything heavier than a sealed envelope. At noon, Portia clapped her hands gently. "Shall we count the morning's generosity before luncheon? It would reassure everyone after recent unkind rumors." Mrs. Hargreaves stiffened. Margaret looked toward the Duke. He was watching Portia now. Not angrily. Precisely. The treasurer usually counts privately. Mrs. Hargreaves said, "Oh, but privacy has become so misunderstood lately." Portia's eyes moved to Margaret's reticule, where the black notebook rested hidden. "Sunlight is kindest." "Sunlight is not kind," Mrs. Penrose said from the wall. "It is merely revealing." A thin laugh passed through the room and died quickly. Portia gestured to Anselm. He stepped forward with Mr. Noyes, and the lacquered collection box was unlocked before the assembly table. Margaret stood close enough to see the coins slide onto the counting cloth: gold, silver, smaller silver, copper. Mrs. Hargreaves read from the official sheet. Margaret checked her tally. At first, the total seemed only slightly wrong. Then the gap widened. 3 shillings missing from Mrs. Vale's line. A half-sovereign absent from Lady Ashburn's second donation. Several smaller coins not present at all, though Margaret had heard the bell and marked them. Her throat tightened, not with fear, with recognition. The trap had not been designed to take much. A large theft might look absurd. Small losses looked mean, petty, plausible, exactly the sort of thing society might believe of an unmarried woman of reduced means who had been seen guarding records too closely. Mrs. Royston put one hand to her breast. "Surely there is some explanation." "There is," Margaret said. Her voice sounded calm enough to surprise even herself. "The figures have been altered by the contents of the box, not by the tally." Anselm turned toward her with grave regret. "Miss Ellery, that is a dangerous claim." "So is your silence, my lord." Several guests drew breath. Portia stepped forward. No one accuses you. We only observe that you kept both names and tallies. You were entrusted with ringing the bell. You seemed so very attached to the whole performance." "Attach?" Margaret repeated. "To being mocked?" Portia's smile trembled with false pity. "Loneliness can make significance tempting. We all understand that. A lady without a household may begin to feel a charitable cause belongs to her." Felicity lowered her voice just enough to sharpen it, and a few small coins might seem little enough if one believed oneself owed comfort. The room changed. It did not condemn her all at once. It leaned. Margaret felt the lean as surely as a hand against her shoulder. Women who had eaten cakes beside her now looked at her reticule. Men who had never noticed her gown noticed its plainness. Someone whispered the word unfortunate. Someone else whispered 40. Duke Kelling-ford moved before anyone else did. But Margaret lifted her eyes to him and held them for one instant. Not yet. He stopped. The restraint cost him. She saw it in the line of his jaw. Margaret turned back to the table. The bell and its stand must be inspected. Anselm's pleasantness vanished for a blink. "That is unnecessary." "Then it should not trouble you." She reached for the bell-box stand. Anselm's hand closed around her wrist. Not violently, not enough to make a scene of force, enough to stop her, enough to remind the room that a woman's body could be checked more easily than her words. A small pain flashed beneath her glove. Before Margaret could pull free, the Duke was there. "Remove your hand." The words were quiet. Nothing in the room moved. Anselm released her at once, but the mark of his grip remained, a heat beneath the glove. Everard did not touch Margaret. He looked at her, not at the watching room. "Miss Ellery," he said, his voice lower now, made private by its restraint. "May I see whether he hurt you?" The question stole her breath more effectively than command would have done. In the middle of accusation, with half of London waiting to decide whether she was thief, fool, or spinster schemer, he asked. He did not display her injury as proof of his outrage. He gave the choice to her. Margaret looked at her gloved wrist. Then she looked at him. "Yes, Your Grace." Only then did he extend his hand. He touched the edge of her glove with such care that the room seemed to vanish around the small, deliberate contact. His fingers did not close around her. They supported, barely, while she turned her wrist. The fabric had not torn. Beneath it, she could feel the soreness blooming. His eyes darkened. "Does it pain you?" "Not enough to stop me." Something like admiration moved through his face before his ducal stillness returned. He released her immediately. The touch was over in seconds. Margaret felt it remain. Portia's voice cut in, brittle now. "How touching! But sentiment does not restore missing coins." "No," the Duke said. He turned to the table and looked at the bell stand. Mechanism might. He bent, not touching at first, studying the base where the polished silver met the lacquered support. Margaret followed his gaze. There, along the underside, almost hidden by ornament, ran a seam that had not existed at the first breakfast. Too smooth for age, too new for accident. "This box has been altered," he said. Anselm laughed once. "Or Miss Ellery has been cleverer than we thought." The room recoiled at the boldness of it. Margaret stood very still. The accusation had found its final shape. Not foolishness, not vanity. Theft, clever theft, theft from poor women. For one heartbeat, the walls seemed to narrow. Then Margaret placed her uninjured hand flat beside the tally sheet. "Then let cleverness be examined," she said. "But let us be precise about whose." The Duke looked at her then, and in the tension between them lay something neither protection nor gratitude could name. He believed her. That mattered. but belief was not enough. The bell sat shining between them, newly polished, newly false, and full of a secret someone had expected her shame to hide. The accusation did not end when the assembly dispersed. It followed Margaret Ellery down the stairs, out through the refuge doorway, and into the London afternoon, where carriage wheels hissed over damp stones and every passerby seemed suddenly capable of knowing what had been said. No one had declared her guilty. That would have required courage. Instead, the committee had produced the softer cruelty of postponement. The bell box, the polished stand, and the altered silver base were placed under seal at the Duke of Kelling-ford's insistence, with Mrs. Hargreaves and the treasurer both signing the paper that tied the ribbon. The missing sums were written in the official minutes as unreconciled. Lady Portia had lowered her eyes at that word as though it grieved her. Mrs. Royston had whispered that unreconciled was sometimes the kindest term. Lord Anselm had bowed to Margaret with the expression of a man attending a funeral he had helped arrange. By the time Mrs. Penrose's hired carriage drew away from the refuge, Margaret's wrist had begun to ache beneath her glove. She kept her hand folded in her lap and did not look at it. Pain, at least, was honest. "You should have let me strike him with my cane," Mrs. Penrose said. "It would have been memorable. It would also have allowed them to call us both unstable. At my age, instability is often confused with character." Margaret almost smiled. Almost. The movement failed before it reached her mouth. Across from her, the Duke sat rigidly controlled, though he had only entered the carriage after Mrs. Penrose sharply informed him that if he meant to escort them safely home, he might as well stop looming in the street like moral weather. He had ordered his own carriage to follow, and had taken the seat opposite Margaret with immaculate propriety, his gloves still on, his hat resting against one knee. He had not asked again to see her wrist. He had already asked once in public, and she had permitted it. The memory of that brief, careful touch remained more vivid than the soreness. That unsettled her. She preferred pain. Pain did not ask questions about the heart. "The bell box will go to a silversmith this afternoon," he said. "Not alone. Mrs. Hargreaves's seal will remain upon it until the examination." Margaret nodded. "Good. I will also send word to several patrons that no judgment is to be formed until the mechanism is examined. They will form it anyway." His mouth tightened. "Then they will be corrected. Correction is slower than suspicion, Your Grace, not when properly applied." Mrs. Penrose glanced between them and wisely chose to examine the window. Margaret heard the steel beneath his calm and understood, with a sinking sensation, that he was not only angry, he was afraid, not timidly, not for himself. He feared what a room could do to a woman once it had agreed upon her role. A week earlier, that fear might have moved her. Now it chilled her, because powerful men often mistook fear for wisdom and called command a kindness. The carriage stopped before Mrs. Penrose's narrow townhouse. Margaret stepped down with assistance from the footman, not the Duke. Everard waited on the pavement until Mrs. Penrose had gone inside, then followed Margaret and her aunt into the small front parlour, where propriety could breathe through an open door, and a maid could be heard moving in the passage. The house smelled faintly of lavender, old paper, and coal ash. It was not grand. It had never pretended to be. Margaret loved it for that. The Duke stood near the mantel, too large in rank for the modest room, and too careful in conduct to make it feel invaded. "Miss Ellery," he said. "I have considered the matter," Mrs. Penrose muttered. "That sounds ominous." He did not look away from Margaret. "You must not attend the board vote next week." The words landed with perfect clarity. For a moment, Margaret did not understand them, because she had expected many things from him. Strategy, outrage, evidence, not absence. "Must not," she repeated. He heard the edge. A wiser man might have retreated. Everard Kelling-ford had not become a duke by retreating from danger, and therein lay the flaw. If you attend, they will make a spectacle of you before the evidence is ready. Portia and Anselm have already turned pity into suspicion. Mrs. Royston will bring half the room prepared to look at your gown before they look at the box. Your absence, properly explained, will prevent further injury while I secure the proof. Properly explained by whom? By me. Margaret looked at him across the parlor. The afternoon light lay on his face, revealing nothing he did not permit. His voice had been careful. His reasoning was sound in the way. Locked doors were sound. And what will you say? That the question of the bell box is under examination, and that no lady should be required to stand before insinuation. "No lady," Margaret said, "or no lady you have decided to protect." A flicker crossed his expression. Those are not opposing thoughts. They are when protection looks exactly like disappearance. He exhaled once, controlled but impatient. "You cannot believe I would let them use your absence against you. They already have." She removed her gloves slowly, finger by finger, because her hands needed occupation if her voice was to remain steady. The wrist Anselm had gripped showed a faint red band where pressure had bloomed beneath the fabric. The Duke saw it. His face changed, only slightly. "Enough." "Margaret, Mrs." Penrose said softly, the use of her Christian name, a warning and an embrace at once. Margaret laid the gloves on the table. "I have spent 40 years being placed out of view, behind younger women at dances, beside widows at suppers, near doors, near ledgers, near duties, never near the center unless someone needed an object lesson. Today they put me at the center only long enough to make guilt visible. If I vanish now, they will not say I was spared. They will say I was hidden." The Duke's eyes held hers. "Let them say it for a day." "I can undo a day, can you?" The question was quiet. It was not cruel, but it struck him. "Your Grace, with respect, you cannot undo what a room enjoys believing. You can frighten it. You can silence it. You can make it bow. But you cannot make it forget the pleasure of having looked down." His hand closed around the edge of the mantle. "I am trying to keep you from being harmed further." "I know." That was the difficulty. His mistake was not indifference. It was care with too much command inside it. She softened because truth deserved fairness, even when it hurt her. "I know you mean it kindly. Then why will you not allow it? Because if kindness removes my voice, it becomes another sort of theft." Mrs. Penrose made no sound now. The maid in the passage had stopped moving. Even the house seemed to listen. Everard looked at Margaret as if he had come upon a locked gate where he had expected an open road. "I would never steal from you." The words came lower than before. Not intentionally. That did what accusation could not. It reached him. She saw the moment it entered. The way his gaze shifted from her face to the room around her, to the modest furniture, to the gloves on the table, to the red mark on her wrist, then back to her. He understood, not fully perhaps, but enough to be wounded by the understanding. Before either could speak again, a sharp knock came at the outer door. Mrs. Penrose frowned. The maid hurried past. Voices murmured. Then the maid entered, carrying a folded note on a tray. "For Miss Ellery, ma'am." A boy brought it from Mrs. Royston's house. Margaret took it. The paper was scented faintly with violets, an affectation of innocence. She opened it and read. Mrs. Penrose rose. "What is it?" Margaret handed the note to the Duke because her hand had become very still. He read aloud, each word colder than the last. "Mrs. Felicity Royston presents her compliments and hopes Miss Ellery's indisposition will improve before the Refuge Board vote, though all will understand if she prefers not to appear while the question of the missing coins remains delicate." Silence followed. Then Mrs. Penrose said, with terrifying calm, "They have already told people she is hiding." Margaret looked at the Duke. He had gone pale beneath the restraint, not weakly pale. Furiously, Portia had moved faster than his protection. Anselm had understood exactly how absence would look. Mrs. Royston had put the lie in writing with sugar around the blade. "Now you see," Margaret said. He folded the note carefully, too carefully. "Yes, do you?" He lifted his eyes. "I see that I nearly helped them." The admission cost him. She heard it. She respected it. She could not comfort it for him. Not yet. Margaret picked up her gloves, though her wrist protested. "I will attend the board vote. I will speak first. The bell box may be examined, the accounts compared, the witnesses called. But I will not be explained by any man, not even one I trust." The last words altered the room, not because they were romantic. They were not. They were more dangerous than romance at this stage because they were true. Everard's expression softened with something like pain. "You trust me? Enough to tell you no." For the first time that afternoon, his control broke into the faintest, bleakest smile. "I have earned that much, then. You may earn more by listening." He bowed his head once. "Then I will listen." Margaret held his gaze. The red mark at her wrist pulsed gently. The folded note lay between them, like a lesson. Outside, London continued moving, already carrying her name from parlour to parlour, trimming it to fit the shape of scandal. But inside the small front parlour, the first false rescue had been stopped before it became another cage. And somewhere in the city, under seal, but not yet understood, the altered bell box waited to reveal whether its hidden space held only missing coins, or the proof of who had expected an unmarried woman's shame to make the perfect lock. 2 days after Mrs. Royston's scented note arrived, Margaret Ellery entered the churchyard of St. Anne's with her aunt on one side and the knowledge of public suspicion on the other. The church stood in a quieter part of London, set back from the street behind iron railings and old plane trees, whose leaves trembled in the warm, uncertain air of late June. It was not a fashionable place to be seen. That was why Margaret had chosen it. No lady hunting gossip would willingly risk mud on her hem unless scandal waited at the gate with a calling card. Mrs. Penrose walked slowly, leaning upon her cane, her bonnet ribbons tied with militant severity beneath her chin. "If His Grace apologizes badly," she said, "I shall cough until he improves." Margaret adjusted the black jet brooch at her throat, more from habit than need. "He has not said he means to apologize. Men rarely announce useful intentions in advance. Sant. I am merely preparing the atmosphere." Margaret looked toward the far end of the churchyard, where a gravel path curved past a row of tilted stones. Everard Kelling-ford stood beneath the shade of a plane tree, hat in hand, his dark coat severe against the pale trunks. He was not pacing. She had known he would not pace. A man trained to command rooms would also know how to command his own restlessness. Yet, even from a distance, she saw tension in the line of his shoulders. He had sent a note that morning requesting permission to call, and Margaret had replied that a walk in the churchyard, with Mrs. Penrose present, would be more suitable. If he objected to being received on her terms, he had not shown it. That mattered. Not enough to erase the wound of his wrong choice, but enough to make her come. Mrs. Penrose lowered herself onto a bench within clear sight and lifted her cane across her lap like a magistrate's staff. "I shall admire the ivy," she said. "Do not mistake that for inattention." The Duke approached only after Margaret stopped walking. He bowed with perfect propriety. "Miss Ellery, Mrs. Penrose." "Your Grace," Mrs. Penrose called from the bench. "Speak plainly. I dislike wasting churchyards." A faint shadow of amusement touched his mouth, then vanished as he turned to Margaret. "I deserved that. My aunt is rarely imprecise, nor are you." The silence that followed was not empty. It held the assembly room, the missing coins, Anselm's hand on her wrist, the Duke's careful touch afterward, and then the parlour where he had nearly turned protection into absence. Margaret kept her hands folded before her. The red mark on her wrist had faded to a pale tenderness beneath her glove. It no longer hurt unless she pressed it. The memory hurt more. "I was wrong," he said. No preface, no defense. The words reached her before she had braced herself. "I told myself I wished to spare you another public injury. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. I wished to remove you from a room I could not control quickly enough. I mistook command for care." Margaret looked at him steadily. Yes, he accepted the word as if it were deserved. "I asked you to disappear, and I called that protection." "Yes." His jaw tightened, but he did not look away. "I am sorry." The apology was simple. That gave it weight. Margaret had received many apologies in her life that were only explanations dressed in mourning. This was not one of them. Still, pain did not vanish because regret had arrived with good manners. "Why did you?" she asked, truly. The Duke's gaze moved past her to the old stones, then returned. "Because I know what a room can do when it decides the story before hearing the truth." She waited. He drew a slow breath. "My sister Beatrice was not ruined by one event. She was ruined by repetition." A remark at a dinner, a pause when she entered, a correction printed in a column that pretended not to name her. Every small thing was dismissed as nothing. Together, they became the only version of her anyone cared to remember. Margaret's hand closed lightly around the handle of her reticule, where the book of remembered names rested. "And you could not stop it?" "No." The word was flat, stripped of rank. "I tried too late. Then I learned to act before harm could gather shape. That habit has been useful in Parliament, on estate boards, among men who confuse patience with weakness." He looked at her with something unguarded enough to make her breath slow. "It was not useful with you. It made me another person deciding where you should stand." Margaret felt the truth of that enter her, not gently, but cleanly. She did not forgive him all at once. Forgiveness, like trust, became weak when granted for convenience. But something in her unclenched. "I will attend the board vote," she said. "I know. I will speak first. Yes. You may stand near enough to hear, but not where the room must look at you before it looks at me." He bowed his head. "I will stand where you tell me to stand." Mrs. Penrose coughed from the bench. It sounded suspiciously like approval. Margaret almost looked toward her, then did not. The moment belonged to the two of them, within the boundaries propriety allowed and truth required. Everard's gloved hand shifted at his side, then stilled. He looked down, as if considering the movement before making it visible. When he lifted his hand, his palm was open, offered, not reaching, not claiming. "May I?" he asked. There was no urgency in the question. And that was why Margaret felt the full force of it. This was not the brief, necessary touch over her injured wrist. This was not an accidental nearness over a fallen brooch. This was a choice placed between them in daylight, in sight of her aunt, under the trees of an old London churchyard where no one could mistake it for passion and no one sensitive could mistake it for nothing. Margaret looked at his hand. Then she placed her gloved hand in it. His fingers closed only after hers had settled. The pressure was steady, warm through kid leather, and profoundly restrained. She had not known a hand could ask and answer at the same time. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The city moved beyond the railings. A cart passed. A bird shifted in the leaves. Mrs. Penrose studied the ivy with heroic intensity. Margaret did not pull away. "We need order," she said at last, because feeling too much required a practical sentence. Evidence first, emotion after. The faintest softness returned to his face. A principle for committees or for life? Both, perhaps. Then evidence first. He released her hand only when she began to withdraw, and the loss of contact was as careful as the contact itself. The bell box remains sealed. "My man has arranged for Mr. Abel Marsh, a silversmith off the Strand, to examine it in the presence of Mrs. Hargreaves, your aunt, you, and myself. No private handling, no solitary custody." Good. The clerk who opened the committee room for Lord Anselm has been seen twice near Noyes's office. He may speak if he believes silence will cost him more than truth. Do not frighten him into saying what you need. I will not. He paused. I would have, once. Margaret heard the admission and stored it carefully. Then we must give him reason to prefer accuracy. That sounds like you. It sounds like necessity. She opened her reticule and drew out the black notebook. The Duke's attention lowered to it, but he made no move closer. Margaret held it against her palm. "If Portia means to make my book appear secretive, I shall not produce it as a shield. The women inside are not armor for my reputation. But 3 living women have given me leave to use their names if ever the refuge tried to deny what was promised them. Miss Bell is one. Mrs. Ada Pike's niece is another, if she can be found before the vote. The third is a former laundress, Mrs. Tully, who saw Lord Anselm's man carry the bell away for polishing. His eyes sharpened. You knew this? I suspected. Mrs. Tully told me yesterday when she came for a reading lesson. She thought it unimportant because gentlemen's servants carry things constantly. It may be very important. Then we ask her. We do not shape her. No, he said. We ask. The agreement settled between them like a plank laid over dangerous water. Margaret looked toward the church door, dark and cool beyond the path. I am afraid, she said. The confession surprised her. It seemed to surprise him more. His face changed, not with pity, but with attention so complete it almost hurt. I know. No, she said, gently correcting him. You know danger. You know scandal. You know rooms. I am afraid of being believed guilty by women whose names I tried to protect. His voice lowered. Then we will give them truth enough to stand upon. She almost smiled. We, if you permit the word. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. For evidence, yes. For more than evidence. The question was quiet. It did not demand an answer, and perhaps because of that, she did not step back from it, earn the right to ask me after the vote. Something moved through his expression, solemn and almost tender. I will. Mrs. Penrose struck her cane lightly against the gravel. If the two of you have finished being sensible under trees, I should like tea before I perish nobly. Margaret turned, grateful for the rescue and sorry for it in the same breath. The Duke offered his arm to Mrs. Penrose for the walk back to the carriage, and the old lady accepted, as if conferring a military honor. Margaret walked beside them, with the notebook secure in her reticule, and the memory of his hand still resting inside her glove. Behind them, the church bell struck the quarter hour. Its sound was clear, unlike the refuge bell, and for the first time in days, Margaret heard a bell without flinching. It did not mean she was safe. It meant she had chosen where to stand. Mr. Abel Marsh's silversmith shop stood off the Strand between a stationer's window and a narrow passage that smelled of rainwater, coal smoke, and metal filings. By the time Margaret Ellery arrived with Mrs. Penrose, the sealed bell box was already on the workbench, its ribbon uncut, its wax bearing Mrs. Hargreaves's plain impressions beside the sharper mark from the refuge treasurer. The Duke of Kelling-ford stood near the far wall, hat in hand, not presiding, not pacing, and not pretending that his rank made him patient. Mrs. Hargreaves hovered beside the bench, with the expression of a woman who had carried a sleeping infant through a thunderstorm. "No one has touched it since the seal was made," she said for the third time. "Mr. Marsh will break the ribbon only in our presence," Margaret replied gently. "You have done exactly what was needed." Mrs. Hargreaves looked as if praise might make her cry, so she frowned instead. Mr. Marsh was a spare man with silver-grey hair, a leather apron, and spectacles that magnified his eyes into solemn moons. He bowed to the Duke, then to the ladies, but when he examined the bell, his reverence belonged entirely to craft. "Old piece," he murmured, "not fine, but honest once. Rim bent years ago, clapper cracked before any recent work. That crack isn't fresh." Margaret's fingers tightened around her reticule. The black notebook rested inside it, alongside a folded note from Mrs. Tully, the former laundress who had seen Lord Anselm's man carry the bell away. "And the stand?" she asked. Mr. Marsh looked at her, not past her to the Duke. Margaret appreciated that more than he could know. "The stand is newer, polished to look companionable, but it wasn't born with the bell." He turned the object beneath the light. "May I break the seal?" Mrs. Hargreaves nodded. The Duke did not answer for anyone. Margaret watched him notice her noticing. Mr. Marsh cut the ribbon and opened the lacquered box first. The coins inside had been counted already and sealed in a separate purse, so the box sat empty, innocent in appearance. Then he lifted the silver-mounted stand and ran a thin tool around the base. At first, nothing happened. Mrs. Hargreaves breathed too loudly. Mrs. Penrose whispered, "If suspense were useful, Parliament would have solved poverty." The tool clicked. A narrow plate shifted outward from the underside of the stand, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment, no deeper than a lady's snuff-box, but large enough to hold several coins until the owner chose to release them. In that cramped hollow lay a smear of dark red wax and 2 tiny silver filings caught in the corner. Mrs. Hargreaves sat down hard upon a stool. Margaret felt the room tilt, then right itself. Proof had a strange effect. It did not undo humiliation. It made humiliation stand visible, like a stain under stronger light. "A false bottom," Mr. Marsh said. "Recently fitted, clumsy beneath the polish. Whoever ordered it cared more for deception than durability." The Duke's face had gone utterly still. "How recently?" "Within a fortnight. The solder is new." Margaret looked at the red wax. Could the compartment be opened while the box sat upright? Mr. Marsh demonstrated with a pressure beneath the decorative foot. A narrow slit within the stand opened and closed. A coin dropped into the box might be diverted here if the stand were set so. Later, the plate could be opened and the coins removed or allowed to fall back. It depends on how one tilts it. Mrs. Penrose's cane struck the floor once. "Elegant wickedness. I hate it less when villains are stupid." Mrs. Hargreaves pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Then Miss Ellery did not miscount. "No, Margaret said softly. I did not. The Duke looked at her then, and the anger in him was so controlled that it seemed almost cold. But she had come to recognize the difference between coldness and restraint. Coldness withdrew. Restraint protected the room from what fury might break. The wax, he said to Mr. Marsh, can it be matched? Not conclusively by me, Your Grace, but it is dark claret with black resin, less common than plain red. Gentlemen fond of family impressions like such things. Margaret thought of Lord Anselm's letters, the thick claret wax on his notes to the refuge, the small theatrical flourish of aristocratic importance. It supports Mrs. Tully's statement, she said, and the clerk's, if he confirms access. The Duke turned to her. He has. The words were quiet. Margaret stilled. When? This morning before you arrived. He came to my man at Marylebone House, frightened enough to tell half a truth, and ashamed enough to tell the rest when pressed with courtesy rather than threat. Lord Anselm requested the committee room key after hours. Mr. Noyes was with him. The clerk believed it concerned donor lists. Margaret let the information settle into place. Bell removed for cleaning. New stand introduced, box counted publicly. Coins missing in small sums. Her name placed nearest every tally. A trap built from politeness, wax, and the assumption that an unmarried woman's reputation would not resist weight. Then we have enough to call them to account, Mrs. Hargreaves whispered. Not enough to make them repent, Mrs. Penrose said, but enough to make them perspire, which is often the beginning of justice. Mr. Marsh wrote his statement in a careful hand. Mrs. Hargreaves signed as witness to the unsealing. Mrs. Penrose signed with a flourish, large enough to frighten ink. Margaret signed last, her name steady. When the others moved toward the front of the shop to arrange copies and sealing, she remained beside the workbench with the open false compartment before her. The Duke stayed, but at a distance. For a while neither spoke. The little hollow in the bell stand seemed uglier than an open insult. An insult at least declared itself. This had hidden under shine. I keep thinking, Margaret said at last, that they chose small coins because small need is easiest to mock. Lamp oil, rent for a week, bread, writing paper, things a room of patrons can misplace in conversation. Everard's voice came low behind her, and because small theft would look believable when placed beside a woman, they had already taught the room to diminish. She turned. You understand that now? Yes, he did not soften the word. I should have understood sooner. You understood the danger. I understood my own fear of it. His gaze moved to the bell, then back to her. After Beatrice died, I made a religion of prevention. No room would be allowed to gather force if I could empty it first. No rumor would breathe if I could crush the lungs of it. It made me effective. It also made me arrogant. Margaret did not interrupt. This was no longer the Duke speaking to manage a situation. This was Everard Kelling-ford, standing without armor where armor had failed him. When I asked you not to attend the vote, he continued, I told myself I was protecting you from the machinery that broke her. But you were right. I was asking you to vanish because I could not bear to watch the machinery touch you. His voice roughened on the last words. That was not your choice. I am sorry. Margaret looked at the man before her, at the restraint that had once seemed cold and now looked more like an old wound disciplined into posture. She thought of Beatrice, who laughed at solemn music and blamed needles for poor embroidery. She thought of her own mother, who had feared women without husbands or sons would be folded out of memory like letters no one answered. My mother used to say that remembering was work, Margaret said. not sentiment, work. She died worried that women like us became footnotes in other people's households, useful, regrettable, then gone. Everard's face changed. Is that why you keep the book? Partly. Her hand moved to the brooch at her throat. Partly because, when she died, people spoke of her as if widowhood had been her character. They forgot she sang badly, hated boiled carrots, and once sold her best shawl so a neighbor's daughter could keep a place as apprentice. They made her sorrow larger than her soul. I could not stop it then. So now I write names before swallows them. The silence after that felt neither empty nor strained. It was full, almost unbearably so. Everard took one step, then stopped. He had learned to stop. The knowledge of that moved her more than the step. Margaret, he said, and the sound of her name without title trembled somewhere deep beneath her ribs. He seemed to realize it and did not repeat it. You have taught me that remembrance is a form of love. The sentence entered her like light, through a door opened slowly. It did not demand. It did not praise her usefulness. It saw the labor beneath her quiet and called it by its true name. For the first time since the accusation, the ache she had held upright inside herself faltered. She crossed the small distance between them. He did not reach for her. He waited, hands at his sides, eyes dark with restraint. Margaret stepped into his arms by her own choosing. Only then did he hold her. The embrace was not dramatic. It was not the stuff of foolish novels hidden under pillows. It was steady, careful, and so full of relief that Margaret closed her eyes. His hand rested lightly at her back, never pressing. Her cheek did not touch his coat, but her brow lowered near enough to feel the warmth of him. For a few breaths, she allowed herself to be held without being managed, comforted without being claimed. When she drew back, he released her at once. His face had altered. So had hers, she suspected. Neither pretended otherwise. From the front of the shop, Mrs. Penrose called, "If the two of you have finished confirming the moral depravity of silverware, there is a notice from the refuge." Margaret turned quickly, grateful for the interruption, and not grateful at all. Mrs. Hargreaves entered, holding a folded paper, her cheeks pale. It was delivered while we were here. A formal summons. The board will meet at Freemason's Tavern tomorrow. Miss Ellery must appear, or she will be removed from all charitable duties. Margaret took the notice. Her hands were steady now. The repaired courage inside her felt different from pride. It had weight. It had warmth. "Then tomorrow," she said, "we bring them the bell." Everard stood beside her, not before her. "And you speak first." She looked at him. "Yes." The false-bottom stand lay open on the bench between silver filings and red wax, its hidden space exposed at last. It had been built to hold stolen coins. Instead, it would carry the truth. The evening before the board vote, Mrs. Penrose's garden looked too small to hold the truth that would be required of the morning. It was hardly a garden by the standards of Mayfair pride, only a narrow-walled strip behind the townhouse with a gravel path, 2 clipped box shrubs, a bench under a soot-darkened pear tree, and late roses doing their best against London air. Yet after the silversmith's shop, the exposed false bottom, the claret wax, the clerk's frightened statement, and the formal summons to Freemason's Tavern, the little garden felt like the only place in the city where Margaret Ellery could breathe without being counted, judged, or arranged. Mrs. Penrose sat just inside the open French doors, with her knitting in her lap and her spectacles low on her nose, near enough to preserve propriety and far enough to pretend mercy. "I shall not hear anything unless someone speaks foolishly," she had announced. "Then I shall hear everything." Margaret stood beside the pear tree, wearing a dark blue evening gown altered so many times that even the seams seemed disciplined. Her mother's black jet brooch rested at her throat. The clasp held firmly now. In the parlour beyond the doors, the sealed packet of evidence lay upon Mrs. Penrose's writing desk. Mr. Marsh's signed report, Mrs. Hargreaves' witness note, the clerk's statement, Mrs. Tully's account of Lord Anselm's man carrying the bell away, the subscription tally, and the folded, printed circular that had tried to turn compassion into vanity. The bell itself and the altered stand remained locked under the Duke's seal at his London residence, to be brought to Freemason's Tavern at 10 o'clock in the morning with Mrs. Hargreaves and the silversmith present. Every object had its place, every fact had its witness. Only Margaret's heart seemed impossible to file in order. Everard Kelling-ford stood a few paces away, hat in one hand, the other resting lightly at his side, as if he had taught even his fingers restraint. He had arrived not by command, but by note, asking whether she would receive him in Mrs. Penrose's presence before the vote. He had not asked to discuss strategy. That, more than anything, had told her what conversation he intended. For a while, neither of them spoke. The city beyond the garden wall rolled on with carriages, vendors, distant bells, and the endless confidence of people whose names had never been made into entertainment. Margaret looked at the darkening sky. Tomorrow, if I am cleared, they will say, "You bought the truth." Some will. His voice was quiet. If I am not cleared, they will say the most desired duke in London allowed himself to be fooled by a desperate spinster with a talent for ledgers. Some will say that too. She turned toward him. You do not sound outraged. I am beyond outrage. Outrage is loud because it still expects surprise. The sadness beneath that answer reached her more sharply than anger would have done. Then what remains? Choice. He took a breath. Yours first. Mine after. Margaret's fingers touched the brooch, then fell away. I am afraid that tomorrow will make everything smaller. My work, the women's names, even whatever this is between us. Public rooms have a talent for reducing private truth into convenient phrases. Then let us speak the private truth before the room has its chance. Her heart gave one hard beat. Mrs. Penrose's knitting needles stopped beyond the doors, then resumed with exaggerated innocence. Margaret looked at him fully. In the dimming garden, Everard no longer appeared merely ducal. He looked tired, disciplined, and more human than society allowed powerful men to be. That made him more dangerous to her composure, not less. You should not say anything tonight out of fear for tomorrow, she said. I am not afraid of tomorrow for myself. For me, then, yes. He did not dress the admission as gallantry. But fear is not the reason I am standing here. Then what is? He looked at her with the same grave attention he had given the bell, the brooch, the notebook, the red mark on her wrist, the hidden compartment built to shame her. I loved you before Mr. Marsh opened that stand. I loved you before I knew how the coins had been hidden. I loved you before there was proof enough for any room to approve of believing you. Margaret went still. The roses moved in a small wind behind her. The world did not stop. That seemed almost indecent. Everard, she said, and it was the first time she had used his Christian name aloud. His face changed as if the name had touched him. I love you, he said, plainly. No flourish, no proposal wrapped around it, no title offered as shelter. I love the way you remember what others discard. I love your severity when mercy has been made lazy. I love that you would rather stand alone in truth than be escorted safely through a lie. And I love you, not because London mocked you, Not because I wish to correct London, but because when the room became cruel, your soul did not. The words entered her slowly, each one finding a place she had long ago closed for economy. At 20, she might have answered too quickly. At 30, she might have doubted him out of self-defense. At 40, Margaret knew the value of silence before truth. She let herself feel the ache, the wonder, the terror of being seen too late, and yet not too late at all. "If you say this now," she whispered, "you must understand what I can and cannot accept. Tell me. I cannot accept love as rescue. I know. I cannot walk into that room tomorrow as the woman a duke has chosen to defend. I must walk in as myself. Yes, if they clear me, I will not have my name replaced by yours before I have had time to stand inside it again. I would not ask that. Men often ask without words." He bowed his head slightly, accepting the rebuke on behalf of more than himself. "Then I will be careful even with silence." That undid something in her, not completely. Nothing worth keeping came undone completely. It opened. Margaret stepped closer, stopping where propriety and choice could still breathe. "I love you too, Everard." The words trembled, but they did not break. "Not because you are powerful, not because you believed me, not because you can make rooms fall silent. I love you because when you were wrong, you listened. Because when you wished to command, you learned to ask. Because you brought me your grief without making it heavier than mine." He closed his eyes for one brief moment, and when he opened them, there was no ducal mask left between them, only a man who had received something he had not presumed to deserve. "Margaret," he said softly. Her name in his voice no longer felt like exposure. It felt like recognition. He looked toward the open doors, then back to her. Mrs. Penrose's needles clicked with deliberate force. "May I kiss you?" he asked. The question was quiet enough to remain theirs, and clear enough to honor the answer before it came. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, not girlishly, but with the deep astonishment of a woman whose life had trained her to expect courtesy. Without desire and respect, without tenderness, she could have stepped back. He had given her that. Instead, she stepped closer. "Yes," she said, "you may." He moved slowly, giving her every chance to change the word. She did not. His hand lifted, stopped short of her cheek, and lowered again, as if even tenderness must earn permission twice. The restraint made her smile faintly through the sudden brightness in her eyes. "Everard," she murmured, "I'm not made of glass." "No," he said, "you're made of courage. That requires gentler handling." Then he bent and kissed her. It was not long, it was not urgent. It was a promise held within bounds, warm and careful, a touch of lips that asked nothing beyond the truth already given. Margaret's hand rose of its own accord and rested lightly against his sleeve. That was her answer, her free answer. When he drew back, he did not move away entirely, but he did not claim more. The garden seemed changed around them, though it was still only the pear tree. The roses, the soot-stained wall, and Mrs. Penrose loudly miscounting stitches indoors. Margaret breathed out, and with the breath went a loneliness so old she had mistaken it for part of her character. "Tomorrow," she said, steadying herself with the word, "I shall ring the bell myself." Everard's gaze deepened, "and I will stand close enough to hear, but not close enough to answer for me. Never again." She believed him. Not because love had been spoken. Words were beautiful and insufficient. She believed him because he had already failed, been corrected, and changed. Beyond the garden wall, London prepared its room, its whispers, its verdict. On Mrs. Penrose's desk lay proof. At Marylebone House, under seal, waited the bell built to shame her. Margaret touched her mother's brooch and looked at the man beside her, the man she loved before any room had granted permission. Morning would bring the vote. Tonight had given her something no vote could bestow, a name spoken with love before it was publicly cleared. Freemason's Tavern had hosted dinners, speeches, subscriptions, and polite quarrels disguised as principle. But on the morning of the Refuge Board vote, it seemed built for judgment. The room was long, high-ceilinged, and bright with a merciless daylight that left no face entirely flattered. At the head table sat the officers of the Ladies' Benevolent Refuge, their ledgers arranged like shields. Along one side gathered patrons and donors. Along the other stood witnesses, clerks, and women who had received assistance from the refuge, some invited openly, and others present only because Margaret Ellery had asked whether their names might be spoken before. Decisions were made about them. Margaret entered with Mrs. Penrose on her arm, her black jet brooch fastened at her throat and her reticule held securely in her gloved hand. She wore the same disciplined grey gown she had worn at the first breakfast. Let them see it, she had decided. Let them remember what they had laughed at. Near the centre of the room, on a cloth-covered table, stood the bent silver alms bell and its polished stand, both transported under seal from Marylebone House that morning by the Duke of Kelling-ford's steward, with Mrs. Hargreaves and Mr. Abel Marsh attending. The seal remained unbroken. The bell looked almost innocent in the hard light. Margaret knew better. Across the room, Lady Portia Draycott watched her arrive with a smile composed of silk and knives. Mrs. Felicity Royston leaned toward a baroness and whispered behind her fan. Lord Anselm Draycott stood beside Mr. Wilfrid Noyes, his expression grave enough to be mistaken for virtue by anyone who had never seen calculation dressed for mourning. The Duke did not enter beside Margaret. He was already in the room, standing exactly where she had asked him to stand, near enough to hear, not near enough to draw every eye before hers had earned its place. When their gazes met, he did not nod dramatically. He simply looked at her as he had in the garden, with love that did not demand to be useful before it was true. The chairwoman, Lady Westmere, struck the table lightly with a paper knife. We are assembled to consider the irregularities discovered in the refuge subscriptions and the question of Miss Ellery's continued duties. Before continued duties are discussed, Portia said, rising with graceful urgency, surely we must discuss confidence. No charitable institution can survive if donors fear their gifts may be made part of some private emotional enterprise. Margaret felt the phrase turn the room toward her. Private emotional enterprise. So much ugliness could fit inside polished words. Portia continued, no one wishes to wound Miss Ellery. We all appreciate the energy of unmarried ladies who seek meaningful occupation. But a woman who keeps private accounts of distressed persons rings the bell for every coin, and then finds small sums missing must expect concern. Loneliness is not a crime. Neither is vanity, but charity cannot become a stage for either. Mrs. Royston lowered her fan. We must be compassionate. Miss Ellery has perhaps attached herself too tenderly to the refuge. That may explain more than wickedness would. Margaret let the murmurs rise. She let them show themselves. Then she stepped forward. Lady Westmere looked startled. Miss Ellery, you may answer after the statements are complete. With respect, my lady, the statements have been completing themselves in drawing rooms for a fortnight. A sharper silence followed. Margaret walked to the table where the bell stood. She did not touch it yet. I will speak first because I was accused first. Not here, perhaps. Not in language plain enough to be brave. but in print, in whispers, in a room where small coins were made to vanish, and my age, poverty, and unmarried state were offered as evidence. Portia's cheeks coloured. No one said poverty. "No," Margaret said. "You all have better manners than that." Mrs. Penrose made a small approving sound. Margaret reached for the bell. Mr. Marsh broke the seal at Lady Westmere's order, then stepped back. Margaret lifted the bell by its narrow handle. It was heavier than it had been the first morning, bright with polish and falsehood. She rang it once. The muffled note moved through the room, dull and cracked, and every whisper stopped. "This bell was first placed out in my hand to make me a joke," Margaret said. "A wedding bell, for a woman of 40 they called it. I rang it because donations were being made for women whose hardship was real, even if the laughter around them was not. Today I ring it for another reason. Not pity, not amusement, truth." She set it down. "Which is more shameful, being unmarried at 40, or stealing from women because you thought an unmarried woman could be blamed?" The question struck harder than accusation. A gentleman near the wall looked away. Lady Westmere's mouth tightened. Anselm gave a soft laugh. "An admirable speech, Miss Ellery, but coins do not return because rhetoric commands them." "No," Margaret said. "They return when hidden compartments are opened." Mr. Marsh came forward at Lady Westmere's signal. He spoke without drama, which made his evidence stronger. He identified the bell, the stand, the original bent rim, the old crack in the clapper, and the recent solder beneath the base. He demonstrated the small pressure point hidden under the decorative foot. The false plate slid open. Several women gasped. The shallow compartment lay exposed. Empty now, except for the dark smear of claret wax and the silver filings Mr. Marsh had sealed in a twist of paper after inspection. "A coin dropped while the stand is set so," he explained, demonstrating with a plain metal token. "May be diverted here rather than into the collection box. Later it may be removed or released. The alteration is recent, within a fortnight." Lady Westmere turned sharply to Anselm. "Lord Anselm, did you authorize work upon this stand?" "Certainly not. I merely sought to have an unattractive bell polished." "With a newly made stand?" the Duke asked. It was the first time he had spoken. He did not move from his place. The room turned to him despite his restraint. Anselm bowed faintly. "Your Grace, artisans often take liberties." Mr. Marsh's grey brows lifted. "Not the honest ones, my lord." A restrained ripple passed through the room. Margaret opened her reticule and removed the packet. "Mrs. Tully, if you please." The former laundress came forward, hands clasped tightly, but eyes steady. "I saw Lord Anselm's man carry the bell away after dark," she said. "Not just the bell, miss. There was a wrapped bit besides. I thought it was foolishness, taking charity silver out, like it were plate, from a grand house." "Thank you," Margaret said. "No more than you know." Mrs. Tully nodded and stepped back. Next came the committee clerk, pale, perspiring, and miserable. He admitted that Lord Anselm had requested the committee room key and that Mr. Noyes had accompanied him, claiming they needed donor names prepared in correct order. Mr. Noyes protested that clerks were easily confused. The clerk, finding courage in offense, replied, "Not so confused as to forget who told me to keep quiet." The room stirred. The Duke handed Lady Westmere a note bearing Lord Anselm's dark claret wax, taken from earlier refuge correspondence. "This is not proof alone," he said. "It is correspondence with the wax trace Mr. Marsh found, joined to opportunity, mechanism, and altered accounts." Lady Westmere examined it, then passed it to the treasurer, whose face hardened with every second. Margaret then laid out the tallies. The missing coins match the times when the bell was rung and the stand was positioned nearest the box. They were small sums, because small sums make poor women suffer and rich rooms hesitate to investigate. But I marked each ring, not because I expected fraud, because I believe accuracy is owed to those who cannot afford confusion. Mrs. Royston tried to laugh. And the private book, are we to forget that Miss Ellery collected women's sorrows as if arranging a little court around herself? Margaret took out the black notebook. She held it closed. This book will not be opened to satisfy gossip. The dead are not decorations, and the living are not exhibits. 3 women gave permission for their names to be used today. Miss Bell. The former governess rose. Her voice trembled at first, then strengthened. Miss Ellery asked my leave before writing my name. She wrote that I was a teacher, not a failure. That mattered. Mrs. Ada Pike's niece spoke next, quietly confirming the promised lamp oil and the aunt who had died before writing to Bath. Mrs. Tully confirmed that Margaret had recorded only what she had freely offered. The room no longer leaned against Margaret. It leaned toward the truth. Portia stood too quickly. This is emotional display. Donors require dignity. Dignity, Margaret said, turning to her, is not silence imposed by the comfortable. These women had names before our committee found uses for them. Lady Westmere rose. Her voice was shaken but formal. The board finds no fault in Miss Ellery's conduct. The irregularities will be attributed to deliberate tampering, and Lord Anselm Draycott and Mr. Noyes will be removed from all refuge influence pending further private action by affected subscribers. Mrs. Royston, your circular and remarks have gravely damaged confidence. Lady Portia, this board will remember who converted charity into ridicule. Anselm's confident pallor had collapsed into grey anger. Noise looked smaller by the second. Mrs. Royston's fan fluttered without rhythm. Portia stared at Margaret, as if a statue had stepped down from its pedestal and named its sculptor cruel. Only then did the Duke move forward. He stopped beside Margaret, not before her. You have heard Miss Ellery's evidence, he said. Now hear mine as a patron and as a man. I love Miss Ellery for the soul this room once permitted London to mock, because London could not measure it. Her worth was never waiting upon my notice, but I will spend my life honoring what you failed to see. The words did not rescue her. They crowned what she had already claimed. Margaret looked at him, then at the room. She placed her hand lightly over his offered arm, choosing it before them all. Lady Westmere cleared her throat, visibly moved. Miss Ellery, if you will accept, the refuge asks you to resume your duties and to direct the reading room's work of remembrance. Margaret touched the closed notebook. I will accept on one condition. Name it. No woman's story is recorded without consent. No woman is reduced to a case number when her name is known, and no bell is ever again rung in this institution for mockery. Lady Westmere bowed her head. Agreed. Margaret lifted the bent silver bell from the table. It no longer felt like a burden, though it remained damaged, altered, and imperfect. As she walked from the room with Mrs. Penrose on one side and Everard beside, but not leading her, she heard no applause. She was grateful. Applause would have made it a performance. The silence that followed her was better. It was the sound of a room ashamed enough to learn. 3 weeks after the board vote, the Refuge Reading Room opened its doors again, and this time no one had arranged a bell to make a woman small. The room had been scrubbed, aired, and brightened with clean curtains at the rear windows, though the same damp London light still laid its grey hand over the yard beyond. The shelves held their practical books, their neglected poetry, their primers, and a new stack of writing paper purchased without anyone daring to call it unnecessary. On the table near the hearth stood the bent silver arms bell, repaired by Mr. Abel Marsh but not made perfect. The rim still leaned slightly. The crack in the clapper remained visible if one knew where to look. Margaret Ellery had asked that it remain. A thing needn't pretend it was never damaged in order to be honourable. She had told Mrs. Hargreaves, and the older woman had nodded so fiercely that her spectacles slid down her nose. The polished false stand was gone. In its place was a plain wooden base, sturdy, honest, and marked beneath with the date of the board vote, so no future committee could forget what had been hidden in elegance. Margaret stood beside it in a gown of soft grey blue, altered from an older dress but trimmed freshly at the cuffs. Her mother's black jet brooch rested at her throat, the repaired clasp firm, the little lock of hair beneath glass as quiet as a blessing. Around the room moved women whose names had once appeared as cases and were now spoken without apology. Miss Bell helped arrange copybooks. Mrs. Tully scolded a coal boy into stacking neatly. Mrs. Ada Pike's niece placed a small vase of late lavender near the window and then stood looking at it with wet eyes until Margaret touched her sleeve. "Your aunt would have approved of the writing paper," Margaret said. The young woman gave a trembling laugh. She'd have asked for 2 sheets and used 4. "Then we shall keep the drawer well supplied." There was no applause at the rededication. Margaret had requested none. Lady Westmere gave a short, formal address, acknowledging the errors of the board, the failure of its oversight, and the new position offered to Miss Ellery as Honorary Secretary of Remembrance and Patron Liaison. The words sounded stiff, but the stiffness was useful. Public institutions often began repentance with awkward sentences. Lord Anselm Draycott's name was not spoken from the table. It did not need to be. His withdrawal from the refuge had been printed in 2 society columns with the sterile phrase, "private financial embarrassment," which was London's way of admitting ruin while pretending discretion. Mr. Noyes had lost 3 committee clients within a week. Mrs. Royston still received invitations, but fewer ladies leaned close when she opened her fan. Lady Portia had gone to Bath with an aunt whose nerves were said to require attention. Margaret hoped the aunt's nerves were strong enough to endure her. When the formalities ended, the Duke of Kelling-ford entered, not as a rescuer arriving after disaster, but as a caller who had waited until Margaret's work had been named before his presence became the room's subject. He wore dark blue, severe and exact, and carried in one hand a small parcel tied with brown ribbon. Every woman in the reading room knew who he was. None of them mistook why he had come, yet because he stopped. First, before Lady Westmere bowed to Mrs. Penrose and asked Margaret whether he might approach the table, the room took its instruction from his restraint. "You may, Your Grace," Margaret said, though the warmth in her voice made Mrs. Penrose lower her knitting to hide a smile. Everard came to stand beside the bell. "Mr. Marsh has done well. He wished to mend the clapper entirely. I forbade it. Naturally. You have a habit of preserving the honest part of broken things." She looked at him then, and for a moment the room, the women, the shelves, the open drawer of writing paper, all blurred at the edges. He had said before witnesses at Freemason's Tavern that he loved her soul. Yet here, in the smaller room where her work would continue after scandal no longer entertained society, the words felt deeper. Love was not only the declaration made before a hostile board. It was this, too, a powerful man standing patiently beside a repaired bell, speaking to her as if her decisions were not charming eccentricities, but law within the life she had earned. He untied the parcel and revealed a narrow brass plate. The engraving was simple. "The book of remembered names shall be kept here only with consent. For charity without dignity is only vanity well dressed." Margaret read it twice before trusting her voice. "You chose the last phrase." Mrs. Penrose suggested sharper wording. "I suggested truer wording," Mrs. Penrose called. He softened it like a politician. Everard's mouth curved. "I softened nothing of importance." Margaret accepted the plate with both hands. "Thank you. There is something more." He did not lower his voice theatrically. He did not take her hand before the room. He simply placed a folded paper beside the bell. "My solicitor has prepared a draft settlement for your review with Mrs. Penrose and any advisor you choose. It protects your independent income, your charitable work, and the custody of your private writings as yours alone. Whether you marry me or decide, I remain better as a patron than a husband." The room went very still. Margaret's heart did not leap. It expanded painfully and quietly until her breath could scarcely contain it. A proposal might have dazzled the room. This humbled it. He was not offering rescue. He was offering a future in which love did not require her surrender. "You are asking for courtship then," she said, "properly. Repeatedly, if necessary. With patience I may not always feel, but will endeavor to practice." Miss Bell made a small sound behind a stack of primers. Mrs. Hargreaves wiped her eye and pretended there was coal dust. Margaret placed her gloved hand upon the folded paper, but did not open it. "Then I accept courtship, Everard. Not because the world has been cruel. Not because you have been kind. Because I love you. And because you have learned that love must leave room for a woman's own name." His expression altered, just enough to make her glad no one applauded. "I love you," he said quietly. "I know," she answered, and then smiled because at 40 she had earned the right to add what her younger self would have been too frightened to trust. "And I love you too." 3 months later, when summer had begun to loosen its hold, and the first coolness gathered in the mornings, Everard asked again in the small cloister garden beside the refuge. The space had once been an unused yard between brick walls. Margaret had made it into a place of benches, herbs, and late flowers, where women could sit with books or letters without being watched as objects of pity. Mrs. Penrose sat near the gate with a shawl over her knees, awake enough to satisfy propriety and asleep enough to offer mercy. The bell rested just inside the reading-room window, visible from the garden. Margaret wore the black jet brooch and pale gloves. Everard stood before her, without witnesses, crowded close, without society, waiting to judge the size of her gratitude. "Margaret Ellery," he said, "will you marry me, keeping your work, your name, your conscience, and any necessary severity intact?" She laughed softly, and the sound startled a bird from the ivy. "That is the most cautious proposal in England. I have had excellent instruction." "Yes," she said, then more steadily, with the fullness of choice inside the word, "Yes, Everard, I will marry you." He took her hand only after she offered it. He raised her gloved fingers to his lips and kissed them, not as display but as reverence. "I love you," he said. "I love you too," she replied. Together they stepped to the reading-room window, where the repaired bell waited in the mild afternoon light. Margaret lifted it and felt its imperfect weight settle into her palm. Once it had been placed there to mock the absence of wedding bells. Once it had been altered to hide theft and shame. Now she rang it herself. The note was still cracked, but it carried. It called no one to pity her. It called no one to laugh. It rang through the reading room, over the shelves, past the drawer of writing paper, and into the little garden where the Duke held her hand. Then Margaret opened the book of remembered names to a clean page and wrote one more line, not as a case, not as a warning, not as a woman finally completed by marriage, but as herself. Margaret Ellery, loved at 40, worthy before love, remembered by her own hand.